It's difficult to overestimate the abilities of Shakespeare because none of us are equipped enough to sufficiently capture his brilliance. Since his arrival in the story of our species, he's outspoken every single one of us. When it comes to his acuity of the human condition, none are as insightful and no one's eye sharper. When reading his works, it's like something that's not from here, and to even try to explain it, the time one spends thinking on the ethic it would require to produce these works, the only conclusion that one can reach is one of sheer amazement. It's astounding that Shakespeare even happened. With that, we're thus gathered here today in an attempt to discuss what's perhaps the greatest individual work from what's almost certainly the greatest individual writer in Hamlet. This is an unscripted conversation between myself and my wife Louisa. We'll be going through the play act by act. This video is to serve as a companion piece to the play for those that have never read it before, as well as those deeply familiar with it. If you are interested in a deeper conversation, on our Discord on the 5th of July, we'll be having an in-person discussion with ourselves and many of our members live to go back and forth with one another on the play. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy our exploration of what may be the greatest thing ever written by a human. We are the House of Tabula, and this is William Shakespeare's Hamlet. So we'll begin with Act 1, and it's actually quite a difficult place to know where to begin speaking about Hamlet, because Hamlet, out of all of Shakespeare plays, is the longest, by quite a margin actually. And in terms of a main character, Hamlet has more spoken lines than any other character in any other Shakespeare play. It's the most demanding role, and because of that, Hamlet himself looms over even all of Shakespeare's other characters. And yet, like other Shakespeare tragedies, it actually begins, the opening scene is away from Hamlet. It's a case of setting the stage, and because Shakespeare is so adept with character, and that's what we're drawn to, we can't forget also the fact that it is still a narrative-based play, and there's a quite famous Deus Ex Machina which occurs at the end. But at the beginning, I actually enjoy the fact that we are seeing something from outside of Hamlet's perspective. And it's similar within Macbeth. The opening scene of Macbeth are the three witches that are talking to one another. And what this gives to me, this idea of a classic tragedy, is the sense that we can't forget that outside of Hamlet's perspective, there are goings-on that occur within this world. We'll see this with Fortinbras also. But something that we'll undoubtedly talk about is the fact that Hamlet, particularly the tragedy of Hamlet, what we get is a narrative that's told through a very myopic lens. And not only a myopic lens of Hamlet, but also of other characters in the way that they see how their personal tragedies are so all-encompassing that they almost neglect these other things around them. But I like that it opens up with Marcellus and Horatio discovering the ghost of the deceased king. And it seems as though that there's this prophetic nature, as though things are destined to happen.
I think right away, Shakespeare is putting us in a very dark environment. He could have chosen to start straight up in the court scene, or he could choose to start in a much more lighter place. But he puts us in right away in this liminal, dark, a ghostly presence. So we know right away that this is not about the real world, right? That we are intrinsically in a space of the unconscious. At least this is how I see it right away. We are in a place that is in between.
Interesting.
Yeah, I see it in between. Obviously, we have the change of kings, which is an in-between space. We have the in-between space of the purgatory, of the ghostly figure of the King Hamlet coming. So, and in between moments as well. This is one of the things I wrote down right away. I mean, we have to speak about, just before we jump straight into the action, I thought it would be interesting to talk about our relationship with the play.
Okay.
Because we both love it.
Okay.
And we read it many times. But it's so weird because every time you read Hamlet, it's like you open the text more, right? And for me, this was the first thing. I don't think I noted that before, that this is an in-between play.
Well,
Not only... Go on.
I was going to say, well, one of the difficulties about discussing Hamlet is its context within the Western canon as almost the apex of all literature. I mentioned here in my introduction, there is a reason, and it's not hyperbole to state that perhaps it's the greatest thing ever written by a person. Its influence will go on forever, and what's unfortunate about us both speaking about Shakespeare in general was the fact that Harold Bloom also existed. And so the very nature of speaking about Shakespeare, not only are we doing it in the shadow of the man himself, but we're also doing it in the shadow of a man that probably second to Shakespeare, had a greater perception and understanding of the written word more than anyone in human history. and so this is by no means claiming that we'll be able to overtake Harold Bloom in our discussion of Shakespeare, but you're doing it in also the shadow of the shadow as well. We are quite lowly on this pyramid, unfortunately. However, I'll try my best not to reference Harold Bloom as frequently, but he referred to Hamlet as Poet Unlimited, which
I love that.
Again, that's the problem with Harold Bloom, is that he's already come up with the perfect descriptors of Shakespeare's world, which is when I was reading through it again, I tried to abandon all my influence from him. I didn't want any reference from him because I know that I will read it and recognize that he's written about it perfectly, and then I will struggle to add anything onto that.
So what did he say? A poet unlimited? Unlimited.
He referred to Hamlet as Poet Unlimited, and it makes perfect sense because I think that you were saying our relationship with Shakespeare, I consider Shakespeare the greatest artist of any medium, and I really do. Every time that I'm exposed to his work, when I know it, I've read Hamlet, I don't know how many times, I've gone through his work a lot, and there's not a moment when I come across something and I know it's emerging that I'm just not awe-inspired. And I think it's good context to actually begin speaking about Shakespeare as a whole before we speak about Hamlet. Also because there are going to be people that may listen to this and this is also their introduction to Shakespeare. Because one of the struggles that people have is, how do I get into Shakespeare? Because the language is so archaic, it feels so alien to now. Contemporary literature has almost completely abandoning the prose of Shakespeare. And one of the things that I would encourage people that are new to Shakespeare is also just to read it. It's just to go through it and accept what comes with it. If you need to read it out loud, I think that it is a big help because these plays were also supposed to be performed out loud. And what you should garner is that the words that are said, you can divorce them from any sense of the context of history, of the context of politics. You are looking essentially at what are complete individuals here that are expressing as best they can an internal world. And we will obviously go through quotations from Shakespeare during this, but in order for us to actually get through and dissect what Hamlet is, we do have to take a step back from the language itself partially, because again, it's difficult to convey to people that you're not exaggerating this. That no. When you explain Shakespearean language, you are taking individual quotes where every line that is written would have been the greatest line from any other author. And you can do this with every single line that spread. His use of simile and metaphor is I can't think of anything other than perfect. He perfectly summarizes the human condition.
It is an aesthetic achievement, I think, to rob Harold Bloom's idea. It is an aesthetic achievement, and I think we often forget in the English language, because I feel like now writers tend to go very colloquial, talk very directly. There is a tendency to try to minimize things as much as possible. But Shakespeare does the opposite. He opens the text and he keeps opening. I find it mystifying that someone even wrote like that, you know? And more mystifying is that not only someone wrote like that, but people loved it. And people flocked to see his plays. And for me, this is so inspirational, right? But to go back to the play, because I think Shakespeare himself is an endless person, and we can talk about him forever. But to go back to the Act 1, Scene 1, which is where we are, we're talking about ghosts here, right? So we are straight up in a realm of, there is a supernatural, there is a symbolic realm that Shakespeare is opening here, which goes beyond just the language that, in the way that he uses the language, right? There's something about Hamlet in general, which is, although it's very flourish in terms of the language that he uses, it's very direct. You can really see, like, every scene is serving the purpose of the story. Like, every scene moves the story forward. And for him to start right away, we see the ghost of King Hamlet, is a very strong statement of opening, right?
Well, the way I see it is that, for me, it marries very well to Macbeth. This idea that there are witches on the outskirts that seem to be plotting something. It's as though we are cast into an event that has already unfolded. It's not as though this vengeance plot that Hamlet discovers, he is not the one to discover it. It's someone else that passes information onto him. So in many ways, Hamlet sees himself as central to this world. And yet, even within the narrative, he's told second. He doesn't come first. There is a world around Hamlet. And I think that this is the important aspect when we're trying to understand what Hamlet is as a character, because we will find ourselves as obsessed as he is with his own vision. And I think this is Shakespeare displaying his irony, which comes at the very end of the play also. For me, the play is bookended by two very ironic statements by him. And that the way it closes is not the way it should close at all, but no one knows, no one realizes that. And the way it opens, we're going to spend 90% of the play with Hamlet, and for him, the play only begins when he enters. But for us, we're aware that these events are already unfolding. He is merely a vessel, even though, as we'll discuss on here, he is stood on the promontory of all of Earth. He is the surveyor of all mankind.
I love that. I love this idea that, just like in Macbeth, there is this sense of faith of the supernatural world that lives in the outskirts of reason. Because even if you talk about Hamlet as the archetypal intellectual character, and the fact that Shakespeare decides to introduce the supernatural world before him.
Yeah.
I find it interesting because Horatio in this scene, he is very skeptical at first when they tell the watch guards tell him about the ghost, and he is not sure, but when he sees it, he's terrified. It's and I don't want to spoil it, but we're gonna have to go back and forth because it's such a complex text. But after, it's very hard to believe from Hamlet's eye that from Hamlet's speech that the ghost is actually real. I'm still not sure.
Yes.
But then I remember Horatio in the beginning. He sees it and he gets scared.
Okay. But Horatio...
And he's a very rational man.
But okay, by the end of the play, we'll go back and forth.
We're going to
go chronologically, but we'll go back and forth. Horatio, by the end of the play, is the one person that stands by Hamlet.
Yeah.
At the end. And I've always tried to figure out what his role in the play is, because at the very beginning, we're introduced to a character that... He introduces himself as loyal to Hamlet and loyal to all of Denmark. And yet, we can also jump into the next scene also with the introduction of Hamlet. When Hamlet is first, not confronted, but first addressed by Horatio, there's a moment where he says, I'm paraphrasing, he says, "Am I correct?" when he calls him Horatio. So Horatio has this great reverence for Hamlet, and yet Hamlet only half remembers Horatio. So for someone that's so important, think about that. For someone that's so important to Hamlet, that is literally at his end, on Hamlet's deathbed, Horatio refers to himself as more of a Roman soldier than a Dane. And he's willing to sacrifice himself because he doesn't even want to outlive Hamlet. He sees Hamlet as this great being. And yet, I think that Horatio is possibly closer to the normal person. I think that we're supposed to, in colloquial terms, we're supposed to identify with Hamlet, but I don't think truthfully most of us do. I think we're enthralled by Hamlet. I think what our perspective is closer to that of Horatio, in the sense that we do, as a reader, we do also look up to Hamlet, but also with this guise that we don't fully understand him. If we actually did understand him, then perhaps we wouldn't look up to Hamlet.
I have something interesting to add up to your perception of Horatio, and even this idea of like the irony of the end as well, but without jumping too much ahead. I love trying to find out what names mean in plays, or especially when names are so different. Like Horatio is such an interesting name. And, Horatio is also the person that suggests for them to tell Hamlet, Prince Hamlet, about the ghost, because he believes that Hamlet will be able to speak to him. Yeah, because they can't. Right in the beginning, we know that they cannot. And Horatio comes from hora and tio, which is time and reason. So he's the timekeeper. And I think this play, it goes again with the same theme, which I mentioned, this idea of in between. And we don't really know when this play was written officially.
Yeah.
But it was around the time of royal succession, Queen Elizabeth's later, like Queen Elizabeth I, later end of her reign. And we know that when royal succession means instability, right? But the timekeeper, Horatio, in a way, he's also one of the most, not only the most rational presence in the play, he's someone that, as you said, he knows Shakespeare. He considers Hamlet, and it's so easy to get intertwined between Shakespeare and Hamlet himself, right? But he knows Hamlet as a person in a way that I think is beyond the court performance, if you know what I mean. And we're going to get into all those elements after. But I thought it was interesting. And it is ironic.
Well, I'd like to actually address something, a reference, a theory, if you will.
Oh, well.
So there is the notion that the source of Hamlet exists in a very fluid region. We know that there are several revisions of Hamlet from Shakespeare. This comes just prior to the first folio, which was the first official collection of all of Shakespeare works. And we have several editions of Hamlet. We know when certain ones were performed. We know of like 3 official versions. But then before this, there is the mythos, the legend of Hamlet that was told. There are dates of it tracing to a Scandinavian myth that was told in Iceland, which seems to be the basis actually for Robert Eggers' The Northman, more than Hamlet. But if you've watched it, it very much appears as an adaptation of Hamlet itself, with that more northern Scandinavian tone. But there is also there is evidence of a play that existed, and it's just now colloquially known as Hamlet, which is like the original Hamlet. No one knows if Shakespeare wrote this originally. There are ideas that Thomas Kyd wrote it, and I believe off the top of my head that this was in around 1592. Some theorists believe that Shakespeare wrote this himself, and that he had many revisions, and so over time he gradually altered Hamlet until he can find the most tragic, perfect version of what it was that he wanted to perform regularly. There is also, on top of this, because we know that the version that we have now was around 1600, somewhere between 1599 to 1602. The version that we have is from there. Some people say 1600, some people say 1602, depending on what version that you have. However, there is also the theory. We know for a fact that Shakespeare had a single son, one son who died at the age of 11. His name was Hamnet. And what we know about English during this period was that names, based on the writing, names were interchangeable based on how you spelt them. Shakespeare spelt his name very differently also. So the idea of Hamnet and Hamlet, they would have been completely interchangeable. Shakespeare's son died aged 11, a few years before the official version of Hamlet came out. So there is also this theory, and it may just be something to ponder on, it may just be an interesting coincidence, that the tragic element of Hamlet also comes from the death of his only son at the age of 11, a few years prior to the play. What do you think about that?
That's a very interesting. I didn't know that at all. It is interesting, and I think my analysis of the play now, it's so much more into the realm of the subconscious, and if it is something that Shakespeare did consciously or not, I still think is an interesting factoid to have in the back of your head thinking about the play. Yeah, it is interesting because in a way we have the reverse of that as well, because it starts with the death of a father, and I mean, it culminates to much more than the death of a father. We can go into that after, but I'm interested in that, in this reversal, you know?
Yeah.
I like that.
It's interesting, but I mean, even you can discuss this on a subconscious level also. It may just be a coincidence. It may even just simply be an homage to a name that he wanted to beautify through his work because of the love for his lost son. But I think that what we can also do now is actually move on to discussing Hamlet into the next scene and the upcoming scenes, because Act 1, Scene 2 is where we're actually introduced to Hamlet. We're introduced in Scene 2 of the major players of the novel. We are introduced to King Claudius and Queen Gertrude. King Claudius has overtaken the previous king, the father of Hamlet, 2 months ago after marrying Gertrude, after his father has passed on. And the way that we're introduced to Hamlet, even in the stage directions, is that Hamlet comes in, and it's noted very, very rarely. Off the top of my head, I can't think of one, but I can't think of an introduction to a character in the stage directions of Shakespeare in which there's a specificity of their clothing. Hamlet enters, and it's specified that he is all dressed in black. And this is the image that we have of Hamlet, this brooding figure that from the moment that we encounter him, he is already different. He's already alien to the rest of the world before he's even uttered anything. But then, as the characters begin to talk, and we're introduced to Hamlet for the first time, the first lines that come from Hamlet are a mockery. They're sarcastic. There's an ironic wit. Claudius is speaking to him, and Gertrude is speaking to him of their family, and he describes himself of his father. He says, a little more than kin and less than kind. And then when they're asking him about this gloom that is shadowing him, he responds and he says, not so, my lord. I am in the sun too much. In this, he's an incredibly
witty.
It's witty, it's sarcastic, and it's a character that from the moment you hear him, he sounds as though he does exist. He sounds as though he has the mind of a real person, of you, the reader, if you were cast into this world where there is this innate performance from people, whether it is through social status or anything like that. Hamlet is so discordant to them all because he feels as though his responses are so close to what you would say.
That's how you feel, that they're close to what people would say. I think Hamlet is so unique. I mean, I understand this idea that he is so well personified and you can feel that he's a real person. I kept saying to you, like, more than anyone, he's a character that you want to quote him, almost like he wrote his own lines. And there's this unease when he enters, because the thing is, act 1 scene 1 is so dark and so gloomy and so scary with the ghost, and then act 1 scene 2 is like, oh, okay, this ghostly presence is outside their realms, you know, but they are pretending that nothing is going on, that, you know, that's no instability. We're all here having this speech. King Claudius is contradictory in the way he speaks. Is like, it's very pompous even, but not pompous in a way. I wouldn't even consider Hamlet pompous. I consider Hamlet deep, but Claudius comes across as pompous right in the beginning in his speech, I think. And when you put him and Gertrude in contrast to the way Hamlet speaks, it's like, oh, Hamlet has so much more depth. Right away, in a simple line, as you said, is so witty and sarcastic, and there's danger in his tongue, right?
Well, I think that at this time, at the publication of Hamlet, Hamlet comes across like a new kind of man, like a kind of man that didn't exist before. And I think the only reason that we would consider Claudius or Gertrude, we would consider them pompous, is because they're simply following the circumstance of their existence. They are going through the decorum of what they're supposed to be. Whereas we can't forget that ultimately Prince Hamlet was supposed to be on the throne at some point. Claudius is speaking in a kingly fashion. And the only reason that we think that is because I think of the contrast to Prince Hamlet.
Yeah.
And I think all the way through this, I always try and remember, can you imagine the possibility that Prince Hamlet would have been on the throne? He has an inability to be kingly. He is too innately alien to everyone around him. He is destined to be this figure. I mean, even he's making a statement also, the fact that he comes in dressed in black, that he's sarcastic to everyone. He's trying to insert a friction into things. And ultimately, even though the Claudius and Gertrude and the court are speaking in ways that are regal and not necessarily, quote, real, they are still doing their duty and performing the role that they're supposed to play. Hamlet has been inserted into this world, and he's not playing his role, even though he should, even though it may not be himself, even though he may have the consciousness and the intelligence to recognize that this is all performance, that this is all persona, but to a degree, he still also needs to partake in that.
And there's also that, although Claudius comes across as pompous, there's also the idea that to reign, you have to remove yourself from the equation in a way and think of the common good. Even if there's a level of corruption, there's a level of rottenness within the surface of Denmark, there is also this idea of the complete man being the king, right? The king represents a complete man. I find it interesting because one of the things that I said to you in private, and I think you see it right away in this the way that Shakespeare introduces Hamlet, I think that the crux of the character is also that he's arrested in development, yeah? That he is removed from the possibility to form his ego and to have ego stability because his father dies, which represents this idea of authority, of protection for the man. And he doesn't have time, he's not allowed to grieve. He has to then be inserted right away to a new king, which is even more complicated when that king is his father's brother. And the whole, it's a mess basically. And the turmoil of what's happening and everyone pretending that this is not really going on, I think it mirrors a bit of the psyche of Hamlet himself, because he is not formed yet. He doesn't come across as formed, and he's unable to really form himself because as soon as the death of the father, and then the boy can become a man, or the man can mature even to the more mature man, but something has to replace his father right away. Something unnatural replaces his father.
Well, here's something. In the narrative of the story, Hamlet returns from Wittenberg. He's been studying. So we know that Hamlet must be at least 18 years old.
Yeah.
He's around 18 years old. He could be 19, he could be 20, somewhere around that region. So we know that he must have developed at least to some degree of adulthood by the time that his father dies. So if there is an arrested development, it would have had to have occurred with his father still alive. So then I would say, what possesses Hamlet to be the way he is?
I understand where you're coming from with this idea that it would have to be when his father's still alive, but I'll push back on that because I'm talking in Jungian symbolism in the sense of like what the father represents to a man at any age. Like the death of your father at any age is an event, an event that will contribute to a deeper individuation, whether you like it or not, whether you are an older man or a younger man. Of course, as a younger man, that would have a much greater impact. But still, we know that Hamlet, it's not that old anyway. But that would be my proposition.
Well, what I suggest is that, there's a section where they're asking him about why when Gertrude and Claudius are speaking to Hamlet, they're speaking about why he's wearing these clothes, about why there is such gloom around him.
Yeah.
And Hamlet responds in an interesting sense, because it says that it's not his inky cloak or his demeanor or anything like that. The way that he says is that those things, they denote him truly. These indeed seem, for they are actions that a man might play, but I have that within which patheth show, these but the trappings and the suits of woe. Hamlet immediately comes across as someone with an incredible perception of the others around him. He's very, very astute of himself, and it's an awareness that the other characters don't seem to possess. It's as though no one around Hamlet can comprehend him and no one can anticipate him. So what I would say in relation to I agree with what you're saying about this arrested development that occurs with Hamlet, but what I also see is someone that's so far beyond anyone else. I wouldn't describe Hamlet as arrested. I wouldn't describe him as suffering in his development. I think that he actually has an excess compared to what most people have. I think that there is something about him which all throughout the play, we're going to see Polonius, everyone struggles with him. They feel as though there's something more within him than what he's saying. And that's because most of the time there is, and it's because Hamlet has this ability to question himself, other people, and constantly morph and transform through the play, which no one else seems to do.
We can go on about, I think more interesting points about this will come as we progress the story, but we're on the same. I think we're on the same page enough, because I don't disagree with you, but I still think that those two things can be true at once. Well, but let's go.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're still at the beginning speaking about Hamlet's introduction, because then when the court leave, Hamlet is left on his own, and we actually hear him have this ability. It's his first soliloquy, and he expresses this immediate distrust of Claudius and Gertrude before he even knows about the ghost of the king supposedly appearing. And the thing is that Gertrude and Claudius, they're resigned to accepting the circumstances from the get-go, whereas Hamlet is suspicious and distrusting of them, and we are as well. It would appear to me that Hamlet is born from friction. I think that in many ways, perhaps it's through my bias, the way I see Shakespeare as just being planted here, I feel as though Hamlet is that also. I don't think there is an explanation. I think that he's almost divine in a sense, that he is not of that world. And I think that because of that, he's alone. He recognizes that he's alone. He doesn't fit into any custom. And as a result, because of this, he's developed such a degree of self-awareness that he's a contemplative character, but he contemplates things until they're completely destroyed. He contemplates everything into annihilation. And I think that we can see this through his first soliloquy also. He's constantly trying to ruminate on this idea of what his mother represents to him now that she's married another man. Now, this man whom he distrusts completely, through either he has such a perception that's beyond everyone else, or everyone else has merely accepted the role, but Hamlet can never just merely accept the role. He has to find a reason for everything, even if that reason begins to contradict itself, and it will just go on eternally.
I think something that Harold Bloom spoke of, which I totally agree, is that Hamlet has a Luciferian intellect, which mirrors a bit Milton's Devil in Paradise Lost. And it was something I noted as well, because this idea that he can get himself in loops of thought, which are very interesting for us, the reader. But I said to you, like, I love him as a character. I hate him as a person, you know? And I think that's very important. And
Can I ask you something about this?
Of course.
So in regards to the Luciferian intellect, because one of the things that was also, because you're approaching it from a Jungian perspective, and a lot of people also approach Hamlet from a Freudian perspective.
Oh yeah, I totally disagree with that.
Well, obviously we can reference Freud himself was very influenced by Hamlet to the point that he was going to call his Oedipus complex the Hamlet complex, because he believed that Hamlet had his drive was an incestuous drive towards his mother. Now, I think that there is a strong... I will simply say, just in terms of a character base, in terms of his psychological profile, I think that the relationship between Hamlet and his mother Gertrude is very, very strong, and I think it's really important.
Yeah.
In regards of, if you can, speak about through the lens of the Luciferian complex, how you perceive the relationship between Hamlet and Gertrude, because, for instance, on that first soliloquy, you know, Hamlet, right? He's a person that is able to analyze everyone all the time about what they're doing, about what he's doing. And yet for someone with such an adept skill at analysis, he doesn't come to the conclusion, he never mentions it, of the idea that Gertrude and Claudius may have been having an affair before his father died. I mean, they marry immediately. And yet for someone as intelligent as him, he never reaches this conclusion.
Well, but that's what I'm saying. I don't necessarily completely agree that he is not arrested in development, because that would be something that a completely individuated person would be able to know, but he's still blind to many truths, including the truth of who his mother is.
Well, he says...
But I don't think that has anything to do with the Luciferian complex. I think the Luciferian complex is more to do with the fact that he's constantly re-examining and destroying things instead of creating things. And I think the most important contrast between Hamlet and Fortinbras with that. Because Fortinbras comes across as a character of will. And a lot of what happens that looms beyond the borders of Denmark is this presence of this will, this action, whilst I believe that Hamlet is incapable to really act. I mean, that's why he doesn't act, he plays, and he performs through play. And we can talk about play in so many ways.
Yeah, there's going to be
a
sequence about this.
The thing is, this is such a complex play that is very hard to want to bring examples from other acts, but I'm trying my best to bite my tongue.
No, but we will have to, because the thing is, in response to that, because then you would say... I mean, in the to be or not to be soliloquy, he mentions people say that it's just about life and death, but it's not. It's we'll go deeper into it. But you mentioned about Fortinbras as like more like a personification of action.
Yeah, and will.
And the irony is that this idea of you say arrested development. I think that Hamlet is the personification of the archetypical intellectual.
Yeah,
but even in today's society, because I don't think that it's not that he doesn't recognize this stuff. I think that he's so intelligent that he can think himself into truths that he doesn't even actually think is the truth, but will then believe it.
Exactly. And I'm not saying that all that he is arrested in development. I think that this is a grand crux of the character because exactly because of that, what we see in the modern intellectual is oftentimes an inability to action, ability to talk himself or herself into hypocrisy.
Yeah.
You know? And
Yeah.
I think Hamlet personifies that, and his blind spots, exactly as you mentioned about his inability to see the truth about his mother, his inability to love Ophelia, which we're going to talk about it after,
Yeah.
to care for a woman that he could have cared for.
But think of
and he could have loved.
But think about that in relationship to women as well, because he says like in that opening soliloquy, rather than coming to the logical conclusion that one, his mother has equal part to play in this, or even that the idea that his mother was manipulative, like a Lady Macbeth character, or that she knew about this and that that her and Claudius were together beforehand, he never reaches this conclusion and instead comes to the conclusion that frailty, thy name is woman. Rather than giving blame to the individual, he decides to cast the blame on all women.
Okay, perfect. I want to mention one thing before we move forward. which is to do with Hamlet's speech in there, when he talks about the idea of an unweeded garden that grows to seed, the idea of Denmark being this unweeded garden, right, full of corruption, full of rot. I had to, and it ties up to the Luciferian intellect, but I had to mention the idea of the Garden of Eden, and even this idea of Cain and Abel after in the Bible, right? As the first murder, the great murder of the Bible. I'm just so interested in that, and I want to pinpoint that here. And obviously we're going to talk about more in the future. But also the garden, again, if we tie up to Ophelia symbolism later on, and Adam and Eve and naming of things. And, we know that in the Garden of Eden, Adam is invited to name things. And I find it interesting that Hamlet, his unraveling as a character, his profound identity crisis that comes from the death of his father, which you could even parallel to the death of a god of some sorts, because his family bonds fail him, his religion offers no comfort, tradition offers no comfort, he decides to wear black to mourn, all of those things that are patriarchal, that are symbolized by the father himself. And I'm doing a parallel here between father King Hamlet and father the god father, and the presence of the father in the individuation process in all elements, spiritual and as a man. And I'm interested in that. And towards the end of this act, between a conversation between Horatio and Hamlet, he talks about the idea of the mind's eye. And then I think it ties perfectly to the death of this god, the death of this king. And now the mind's eye is the center of this character. It is a Luciferian intellect, but beyond anything, it's still a pulsing life inside that mind's eye.
Yeah. Well, let's continue with the act, because the following scene we're introduced to Ophelia and Laertes, which are brother and sister, and they are the son of Polonius, who's also an interesting character which will have his own role to play. We're introduced to them. Ophelia is referencing that she is somewhat romantically involved with Hamlet in some way. And Laertes is warning his sister against Hamlet. And the irony is that perhaps this is looking at it through a contemporary lens, but I would only assume that this is archetypical for the time also, is the contrast, because we've just left Hamlet, who has also just been told by Horatio and Marcellus to go with them because they've been told, they're telling him about the ghost and he follows them. And we've just gone from this soliloquy from Hamlet, which even by Shakespearean standards, he's so theatrical. He ties himself to all of mankind. His lens is so myopic. The way he describes things, it's as though that he understands that the world exists, but it's only through his lens. And then he mourns so much. And then we cut to Laertes, who is warning Ophelia about Hamlet. And the thing is that Laertes is correct in warning Ophelia, but at the same time, it can't be denied that Laertes comes across as a man as so much more empty, so much more boring than Hamlet initially. He seems so safe without this edge. He's the complete logical materialist man who happens to be correct, but it's the obvious draw of the shadow that is Hamlet in comparison to Laertes.
To all the characters. And I find it interesting as well because they, both Laertes and Polonius give her advice when it comes to Hamlet. And different from the advice that Claudius and Gertrude give to Hamlet, Ophelia takes the advice.
Yes.
Right away.
Yeah.
She obeys, right? Hamlet doesn't. Hamlet argues in favor of his own,
Yeah.
He almost convinces them as well. Ophelia agrees to obey.
Arguably, because we think of the tragedy of Hamlet, but ultimately Ophelia is perhaps the more tragic character.
I agree.
From what happens to her, from doing all of the right things. And she's also used in many ways as a pawn from some of the other characters. I
have something to ask. Did you thought it was a bit... reading again, and it might be my corrupt mind, but I think there's something quite uncanny between the brother Laertes and Ophelia's relationship, which borders on incestuous in the way that he talks to her. It's quite weird.
I think that
perhaps it's a tradition, like, you know, of the times.
Well, I think that the familial structures within Hamlet, because there are other novels in which incestuous themes are within the works of Shakespeare, but I do think here that this is an ongoing theme that occurs throughout it, of the relationship innately also between men and women, because I think that I am fascinated in the recurring mentions when you really try and delve into Hamlet's psychology of how he's an obsessive character by nature, but the perception that he has of his mother appears so particularly warped, and I think it's very important. And I think perhaps this is also something that's mentioned within the relationship between Laertes and Ophelia. I also think that it's also just establishing the relationship between the two for the tragedy that will occur after, though, primarily.
Yeah, I think I didn't wrote that many things about this act besides the fact that we introduced to a bit better to Ophelia, and I noted her as the anima aspect of Hamlet himself. Like, even the name Ophelia comes from the word, the meaning aid or to help or to be a helper. And I find that quite interesting because I feel like Hamlet's part of the crux of him being arrested and available, but also being someone in turmoil, is the fact that his relationship to the two anima characters of his work, meaning the feminine side of his psyche, are quite corrupt. His mother, Gertrude, and Ophelia, the person that he has a very interesting relationship with. And here, I feel like it shows right away that Ophelia herself has a difficult relationship to her feminine, in the sense that right away she is being oppressed by two male characters that are quite strong, Laertes and Polonius, through advice, but it's still a form of oppression. She's not allowed to do what she wants, which is to be around Hamlet even. Yeah, I just noted that. I thought it was interesting, especially because of the time as well that this play was written.
I think one of the most interesting points that comes in this scene is when Laertes is speaking to Ophelia, he mentions that when he's speaking of Hamlet, he says his will is not his own. And that can mean a couple of things, because then what he also says is, for on his choice depends the sanity and health of the whole state. And it relates, funnily enough, to what you mentioned about this idea of the weed being spread, as though Hamlet is in some physiological way, in some spiritual manner, that he is connected to the earth, in the sense that he represents this collective madness. He represents this shadow, that if something is lurking within the world itself, then it will present itself in Hamlet. And Laertes seems to catch on to this, because he says his will is not his own. And I think that what Laertes is actually saying is that his will is not his own by right of his birth, because he's the Prince of Denmark and he will be the King of Denmark. However, I think what he unconsciously is saying, because then he immediately follows saying the health and sanity of the state is dependent on him. I think he unknowingly recognizes that the two are interchangeable, because then immediately following that in the next chapter, when Hamlet goes off on his own to see the ghost, that's when we hear Marcella say the famous line, something's rotten in the state of Denmark. That alone, I mean, the state of Denmark being the nation of Denmark, and the state of Denmark as in the current circumstances of the situation, and Denmark being represented by the land and by Hamlet himself. There's so many different goings on with this, and I think that this is intrinsic to Shakespeare's incredible understanding that in 1600 was able to latch onto what the notion of the individual and the collective shadow was all at once. And so we can close the act of the moment in which Horatio and Marcellus take Hamlet to actually meet the ghost of his father. The common narrative thing, and the unavoidable narrative thing that we have to mention, is that throughout the play, no one hears the ghost speak except for Hamlet. Many people see the ghost. When the ghost is present, other characters also don't see the ghost. But there is this unavoidable facet that the only time the ghost speaks is when no one else is around to hear it speak.
I find it interesting as well that in this between scene 4 and 5, which we should do it together because really he's moving along to see the ghost and it culminates in that scene. I think it's interesting that King Claudius is drunk or participating in a drunk festivity of some sorts. I think it mirrors Hamlet's intoxication himself with his own possibility of seeing his father, but also with his own psyche. Like, I wrote that down right away. There's an intoxication which is of the court, but also the intoxication of the subconscious itself. And I think this transitional scene between scene 4, which is a very transitional scene, shifts the setting and it moves us into darkness once more. Even though I think for me, this is a place that Hamlet feels more at himself. I feel like he feels dark himself. And when he shifts between the core and the outside space of darkness and mist, it doesn't feel like he's out of place. It feels much more that he's out of place in core.
Yes, it feels like that is where he resides because he resides in his own internal world, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And when you envision Hamlet, he's speaking to himself. He's surrounded by darkness. That seems where he's better because that's where he's able to question. That's where he's able to contemplate. He doesn't like the structure of the world. He likes these immaterialities. He likes these oceans of thought that are endless, that have nothing concrete to latch onto. But when we actually encounter the ghost of King Hamlet speaking to him, another thing that must be acknowledged is that as the father of Hamlet, the original performance of the plays, Shakespeare himself was actually the ghost, and he was speaking to Hamlet.
Oh, I love that. Because I was going to say, okay, one thing I didn't mention before that I think is perfect now is this idea of the subconscious of the characters. Because you said something about, I think, Laertes, anyway, one of the characters, side characters. And you're saying, like, he said this, but at the same time, he's subconsciously thinking. And I'm thinking, the subconscious is Shakespeare then. Like, if the character is saying that and that's what he's thinking, his subconscious is Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And there's so much space in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, this idea of the ghost being interpreted by Shakespeare is amazing. Because I noted the ghost as the archetype of the wise old man, but also the shadow of the father, is both things that interplay at once.
Well, here's what I pick up immediately, is that this is the instigation of the plot, is when it's revealed to Hamlet the Claudius poisoned King Hamlet in his ear, killed him, and then usurped the throne for himself. This is what instigates the remainder of the action throughout the play. But what we get here is this is supposed to be a revenge tragedy. This is supposed to be a revenge plot. And yet, the way that the king speaks to Hamlet is not in a necessarily kingly fashion. He's not speaking about justice for the throne. He's not speaking about the right thing to do for the nation. He's speaking in a very personal way to Hamlet in what I've always perceived as a very authoritarian, manipulative manner, because at no point throughout it, I mean, this also comes from Gertrude throughout the play, at no point does Hamlet's mother or father mention anything about their love for him.
Yes, I know.
Everything that he says to him, it's a demand of revenge, not for the throne, not for the crown, but for his father. Even to the point that he says, like, in such a manipulative manner, he says to Hamlet, he says, "If you ever loved me." To which Hamlet, I mean, there's very few instances throughout the play in which we actually get to see and are confident that the emotion that Hamlet portrays is one that's real. But I think in the scene where he's encountering the ghost of his father, he's completely submissive to it. We don't see this for any other point.
And that's the genius of Shakespeare, because usually I think here this mimics this idea of a call for heroic transformation in a hero's tale, for example, because the wise old man gives the hero a mission of some sorts, right, in like classic storytelling. But here the wise old man, which is the ghost of the father, is also the shadow of the father, the shadow of this new and dark, I mean, something's rotten in the core of all of this, right? So it's a transgression of the call of the hero. And we don't even know if this is all happening in Hamlet's mind.
Yeah.
And And I'm talking about the hero in this, in obviously like Shakespeare's way beyond that, the classic tale of the hero, but I'm talking also in the sense of the Jungian individuation process as the call to be a hero within your own psyche. And Hamlet, I think, struggles more than anything with the idea of the self. Although he thinks more than anyone about himself, although he is more aware than anyone, you can see the uncertainty in all his language. You can see the uncertainty in the way that he integrates this shadow of truth, of morality, of the duty that he has and who he is and who is around him. And in this scene, in all this aspect, you see all of this at play with just the archetype. Just the archetype.
Well, the idea that, Hamlet is distrusting of everyone, and there is a sense of distrust of his father to a degree. But the way he responds to it after his father tells him, Hamlet says, "Oh, my prophetic soul," in the sense that he already knew this. But throughout, we're going to see that all these doubts continue to emerge in Hamlet because he's constantly questioning himself. But one of the other things, again, the relationship between the father and the mother, between Hamlet with his father and Hamlet with his mother, is that when the ghost is explaining that he speaks of Claudius, of this incestuous wretch, and he is focusing on Claudius as the murderer, and then Hamlet actively, after the fact, when he has his chance to espouse what he feels about the situation, he's again speaking more about Gertrude. He's speaking more about his mother, about how she was seduced and whatnot. And it's just that Hamlet, undeniably, I don't think that it's an Oedipal complex. However, there are clear elements of it because his relationship with his mother is so one-sided, is so imbalanced compared to everyone else. And I just wanted to also mention something that you said also, which was regarding the relationship with his father and sorry, about his intellect. I think that what we're demonstrated here is this idea of moral justice, this idea of what ultimately in this revenge plot is Hamlet hoping to achieve on a pragmatic term. He's heard that his father has died, and so on a personal basis, he believes that the right thing to do is to exact punishment on Claudius, and there will be no repercussions from that because that will essentially bring balance. That's the right thing to do from his moral standpoint, which, whether he actually believes that, we don't know. Because immediately at the end of this, the moment that the Hamlet has the ability to think is when chaos begins to reign, because Hamlet will think multiple things at once and they'll all be true to him, and that's where he likes to reside. Like you say, he has this ability he lives within the shadow.
I have a question for you, which I think before you read whatever you want to read, because I know you're holding the book, what do you think about this idea of King Hamlet having been poisoned in the ear? Obviously, that's the connotation with corruption.
Yes.
But also Hamlet being the only person that can hear the king's ghost speak.
Oh, yeah.
That is such a great connection there that we have to talk about it, because we are going to the night of the soul type of thing. He's going to the unconscious. He's going to this mystic realm. He sees the ghost. The ear, he can only hear. He is the only one that can hear it. And the ear is also a symbol in it's a biblical symbol of spiritual awareness, right?
Well, there's also the connotations that occur throughout the play of this idea. I mean, it's not out of the realm of Shakespeare's irony to find, how would you say this? To find the organ in which injustice has been enacted upon to then be reciprocated by Hamlet as the organ in which he can find some kind of retribution with. The reason that Hamlet can hear the ghost is because the ghost is not speaking. No one can hear the ghost. The only reason that Hamlet can hear it is because he has decided that through the poisoning of the ear of his father, he can only be the only existing conduit that would be able to hear such an injustice, because Hamlet is the only person that could even comprehend such injustice. We'll hear in the next act about how, had the players of the play had the passion that he had, then they would weep tears that were like an ocean on the stage, because to him, no one else feels what he feels. No one else understands what he understands. And this obsession with himself is actually presented at the end in his final speech with his father, because he says when he feels as though he has this realization of what occurred to Claudius, he says, "From the table of my memory, I'll wipe away all trivial fond records, all sorts of books, all forms, all pressures past, that youth and observation copied there, and thy commandment all alone shall live within the book and volume of my brain, unmixed with baser matter." He is claiming to Claudius that this will be his only goal, to such an obsessive degree we will see throughout that it borders on the irrational. And we will also see this because he has the means to exact his revenge multiple times and has to convince himself otherwise that there is a greater reason that he can't. Again, you mentioned inaction, and I think that's a fundamental thing, but I think it's beyond that. I think it's the ability to have action and refuse it because you have even more than this material world could offer. You transcend action. That's Hamlet's perspective. And I also I wanted to end on something that you brought up about the biblical connotations, because I actually think that at the end of this act, I haven't mentioned it to you before, and I haven't actually heard anyone mention this before. I believe there's a strong biblical connotation at the end where Hamlet, who carries a sword around with him, but he's more known for imagetically carrying a skull and carrying a book. He is not the archetype of a soldier. He's not the archetype of a warrior, which is funny because of how the play ends. But he decides to, after meeting the ghost and he leaves, he speaks to Horatio and Marcellus, and he asks them to swear not to tell anyone about this. And he says, "Swear on my sword." And they swear on it, and they swear 3 times on the sword. And to me, this is a kind of reversal of the idea of Peter after leaving the Garden of Gethsemane, that he denied Jesus 3 times. I think that this is a play on the kind of the ego of Hamlet, that he knows that he can trust Horatio, and yet he demands 3 times that he swears on his sword. A sword he ultimately probably isn't even anticipating. In his deepest consciousness, knows he does not have the ability to use. Yet he requires from the only person in the play that will trust him, that he has to swear 3 times on this, almost elevating himself to this messianic figure.
I also haven't heard anyone talk about that, and I wrote it down very similarly. But I wrote down this idea of almost a binding ritualistic moment of witchcraft beyond even the biblical. I wrote down almost this idea of this psychological initiation that comes with something ritualistic.
So we continue with Act 2, and Act 2 is the most concise act of the play. It opens, there are only 2 scenes in it, and it opens with a very, very brief scene, and it's with Polonius and Ophelia. And it deals with the reactions that have occurred out of our sight to Hamlet's madness. This shows there's an elliptical nature to the play sometimes, because we're not told how much time has passed since Hamlet has encountered the ghost of his father, but we're seeing that enough time has passed that people are having rather strong reactions to the sudden change in demeanor from what was already a frictioned demeanor to everyone else that Hamlet has. Ophelia confronts Polonius regarding Hamlet's insanity, and she describes to her father a fear in this idea that Hamlet actually loves her.
Yeah. What do you think about that though? Because I don't understand why fear, and I think it has has to do with the idea of love sickness in a way, this misinterpretation of Hamlet's madness. But what do you think?
Well, I think it's a classic. I think it's a classic tragic tool that Shakespeare uses in this idea that Ophelia ultimately has been romantically involved with Hamlet in some way, and all of a sudden there is this. I mean, just the idea that Ophelia would have been attracted to Hamlet, and yet from the way that I see Hamlet treat Ophelia, the way that I see Hamlet speak to Ophelia, I can't imagine Hamlet not being this prior. I know that there's a recognition that all of a sudden there's this sudden madness that exists within him, but can you imagine Hamlet being in a position where he is courteous, where he is chivalrous with Ophelia? Because I can't. And so I think that, Ophelia clearly has a disposition to fall into madness herself, perhaps also this attraction to the shadow that is Hamlet, counteracted by the juxtaposition of her brother Laertes, who shows this stability. Ophelia is a complex character within herself, and so perhaps there is this shadow where Hamlet has a death drive that I would consider.
Oh, okay.
I think that Ophelia probably has some female longing equivalent in her desire for Hamlet.
Yeah, I think in many instances in the play, they mirror each other, right? Even as Hamlet feigns madness and then ends up actually falling into madness, in my opinion, Ophelia falls into madness in a very feminine way. She loses the ability to speak coherently and all that. And if anything, Hamlet gains even more of an ability to speak coherently. He becomes even more rational, more outspoken. And I think this is interesting, but I don't want to go too far ahead with this.
Yeah.
But what I did wrote about the scene, which I think it was interesting, is this idea of language being used as something to twist and manipulate, which I think works in a double way here. Between obviously Polonius and the inner plots of the story that run deep within the corruption of the core, but also this idea of Shakespeare himself acknowledging the power of language.
Yeah, obviously we don't want to jump ahead because Ophelia has essentially an entire sequence dedicated to her. But what happens is that it's agreed that Ophelia will test the veracity of Hamlet's madness, and she will then proceed to essentially be a pawn to discover on behalf of Claudius and Polonius how can we diagnose Hamlet's madness, what there is to be done about it. And I think that this is something that we'll mention throughout, because for me, what happens is that there's a big I think not necessarily that there's a justification for Hamlet's actions, but I think the world that he inhabits is one of performance, is one of artificiality, and it comes really strongly in the upcoming scene. And also, because you just mentioned about the relationship, the power of words, I think that for me, this Act 2, Scene 2 is completely avant-garde for the time. We do have historically instances of plays within plays that occurred through the time, particularly Thomas Kyd also had this, but the manner in which Shakespeare subtly inserts himself as the role of Hamlet later on, and this idea of the ability of what a play will instigate in the audience is almost like a theoretical piece put into fiction on behalf of Shakespeare. Because the irony is as well, is that when Hamlet is reintroduced into this upcoming scene, he's reading a book, and Polonius approaches him and asks him what he's reading, and Hamlet just says words, 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 as though words are meaningless. But if ever there were a character to display the ability of what words are, it would be Hamlet. And I think he knows this. And this sequence in which we are interacting with Hamlet and Polonius, we're seeing someone who is the ultimate liar, to the point that we cannot discern how much of him is true, how much of him is false, and I don't think he can either.
And you know what's something interesting as well is that Polonius' vision is so oversimplified. He cannot fathom anything more than Hamlet being love-seeking. He oversimplifies even Hamlet's madness,
Yeah.
He's like, oh, Ophelia won't give him love. Therefore, it must be that he's lovesick. It's such an oversimplified version of the truth. And it's again another example of how Hamlet is beyond all those other characters. I think the only character that mimics as much depth as Hamlet himself is Ophelia. She just externalizes it in a much more physical way.
Yeah.
Whilst Hamlet's extremely verbal and rational. Ophelia, she gets deeper and deeper into the waters, which is also the feminine archetype.
Yes.
So we can go into that, but I think she's also a deep, deep character.
Well, I think in relation to what you just said also, I think this idea, like, Polonius is by no means, he has been portrayed as a fool before in certain interpretations, but I also think that, I think all the characters of the court are relatively insightful characters. It's just that none of them have the ability to anticipate and keep up with Hamlet. And I think one of the perfect lines of this is because Hamlet, when he's speaking to Polonius is attempting to diagnose the madness of him, to which Hamlet mocks him. He calls him a fishmonger, and what Polonius says is that they have a small aside in which they're speaking to themselves and no one else can hear it, the audience can hear it. Polonius claims he cannot quite figure it out, but he does have the perception to describe Hamlet's responses as pregnant, in that Polonius recognizes that whatever Hamlet is saying, it inhabits inside of it something else. And he recognizes that. I think that this is the crux of what Hamlet existing within this world. I think this is also the crux of the shadow of being an intellectual, even in today's society, is this idea that because there are these logical loops, because you do have the ability of the way you may twist a word, turn a phrase, or even knowingly convolute an idea, and as long as it still sticks within your frame of logic, it's technically true. You end up actively you actively obfuscate the truth, and people can recognize that. And the characters around Hamlet know that, well, they don't know, because I don't even think Hamlet knows. They are assuming that Hamlet is operating on the same terrain as they are. They believe that you inhabit a truth, you profess it, you may say one thing but mean another, but Hamlet doesn't say one thing and means another. Hamlet says one thing and is also saying 5 other things and also disregarding another. And he is ever changing with this. And the terrain they think that the other characters believe that Hamlet is on the same train as them. He's not on a train. It's as you said, he's floating in the shadow. He's in the mist. You cannot grab him.
I think it's interesting to go ahead and when Rosencrantz and Guildenstern get into the picture, and I think it is interesting because for me, this is one of my favorite sections of Hamlet's speeches. It's not even so much of a soliloquy as the other ones, but there's something that he says, which is man being the quintessence of dust.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't want to go too ahead if you want to introduce the scene a little bit, but...
Well, we're introduced to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and I suppose they're the more amiable characters of the court, in the sense that they have known Hamlet for a long time. They're like childhood friends of Hamlet, but their job is to spy on Hamlet, yeah? And the thing is when they go to spy on Hamlet, it doesn't seem, they're not doing it in a malicious fashion. If anything, many of the times that they do interact with Hamlet, it seems as though that they're trying to distract him from his madness because they're childhood friends and whatnot. But they spend the entirety of the play being manipulated by various members of the court. And I think that what's interesting about this now is that after his interaction with Polonius, Hamlet interacts with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and he does end up picking up on the idea that they are spying on him. And what ends up happening, what we have to remember, is that throughout this entire play, every single person that's interacted with Hamlet has approached him in a way that is a performance, has approached him in a way that they are saying one thing, and actually have an ulterior motive. They have other intentions. Ophelia, in Act 3, when she goes there, she's a pawn placed by Claudius and Polonius to go and spy so that they can overhear. When he goes to Gertrude's chambers, it's Polonius is waiting behind the curtain. Claudius, again, is doing this kingly regal thing. Gertrude possibly knows. And even here, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are speaking to Hamlet as spies. So from the perspective of Hamlet, Hamlet probably lives in this maddening world in which he's prone to this melancholia, in which he's prone to this madness, because perhaps he too recognizes that people are speaking to him in one way, and he can sense that they're meaning something else. If Polonius can recognize that Hamlet's responses are pregnant, as he would describe it, then surely Hamlet, possibly throughout his entire life, has recognized this idea that people are saying one thing and meaning another. His parents, his mother and father, never expressed love. He's had to essentially raise himself. He is a being of complete isolation in which everyone speaks to as this vessel that they need to figure out what it means.
Yeah, and I agree. And in a way, Hamlet himself is performing because he decides to feign madness. I believe that he is mad. After a while, his madness, his obsession is so grand it becomes madness. But there's a level of like how much of those interactions have them caused him to then become also a persona of himself, you know? Because I do think that his struggle with his self-image, his idea of the image of humanity is collapsing. That's why he uses the term the quintessence of dust. You know, almost, again, going back to Genesis, for dust thou art and to dust shalt thou return. You know, for me, that it's absolutely the loss of psychological grounding, the loss of spiritual grounding that Hamlet is going through, you know, this idea of the noble potential of man. He speaks about in the soliloquy, the potential of greatness, what a piece of work is a man, how noble is in reason, how infinite in faculties, but at the same time, a quintessence of dust, meaning that doesn't matter how we can make ourselves grand, we're always going to fall short in a meaningless world, in a corrupt world, right? And sorry, I have to mention, because we only know about King Hamlet through this idealized visions that Hamlet has of his father, right?
The legend of a man that died too soon.
Exactly. And what a piece of work is a man. But in reality, he's also the quintessence of dust. He's a ghost. He's the ideal versus the real. And Hamlet, it's constantly playing with this dichotomy. I mean, Shakespeare is playing with this dichotomy. Because also, we have to mention, we also hear the ghost.
Yeah.
As readers, right? But I think that this theme, this underlying theme of the potentiality of man, through also the potentiality of Hamlet being lost towards the end of the play, is something that in this particular speech is brought up to lie. And but then Hamlet says, "Man delights not me."
You see, yeah, because my perception of this is perhaps from Hamlet's lens, is a more pessimistic view. It's very attuned to what you're saying, and I agree with it. But again, throughout everything that Hamlet says, I think there's multitudes to what he says.
But the reason I'm saying this, and I would love to hear what you say, is because the idea of the quintessence is also the fifth element, the purest substance in nature.
Yeah.
And men being this quintessence of dust, meaning the purest form of dust.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, look, because he starts off this section, he says, "What piece of work is a man?" And he's talking about man in totality. And this phrase came at the moment that he sensed that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are actually spying on him. In that this minor betrayal from his friends, which ultimately is an order from the king, and he, as a prince, should be aware of this. However, Hamlet, in all of his logical reasoning, he's an incredibly fragile person at the same time. Even this act of vengeance is not for anything other than this sense of self-righteousness that he possesses. And so, much like he chastised all women because of Gertrude and Claudius marrying, he does the same here. Hamlet curses all of mankind because of this very minor and understandable betrayal from his friends. He's always been, from the beginning of the play, he's always been incredibly theatrical, and he can't explain any context outside that of his own reasoning, which even that he's completely untrustful of. He should, in the incredible logic and intelligence that he has, much like being able to identify that his mother had a role to play in the marriage of Claudius, he should be able to identify that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are beneath the king and are doing a service for the king. It is not a personal attack on Hamlet, but anything that seems to enter Hamlet's world can only be understood through this warped vision, because in many ways he is the center of all the world. He says, in fact, just at the beginning of this, he also says, they were asked why Guildenstern asks Hamlet why he feels this way. And he says that, I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, foregone all custom of exercise, and indeed it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. Even that description of it, he's describing the earth, the totality of everything, as empty. There is nothing beyond what he said in Act 1, this absolute obsession, this commandment which will take place in his brain, and it will be the only thing that exists there. But as he says, he describes the earth as a promontory. He describes it as this precipice. It's something that he is stood upon, that he's looking over everything. It's not as though the earth is hollow and we are all part of it. The way he describes it is that he is the apex at the minute, but he doesn't even recognize that he's saying that with the depth that he has. And in relation to what you say about this quintessence of dust that he says, as he goes on, what work is a man? This idea is that because he is on this sterile promontory, he is the apex. And the only truth that can exist when you are a person stood on a pinnacle of earth, the only real truth is your truth, because you can see all the other truth. You are on the mountaintop looking down, you have a better view of everything. And the quintessence of something is also the pinnacle of it. So for man is the quintessence of dust with everything that it possesses. From his perspective is the human condition can be no more than dust. There will never be anything that will amaze Hamlet. There will never be anything that will give him joy. There'll never be anything that he can cast aside that inky cloak that he wears. He's a character completely inhabited by melancholia. And whether it was that made him so contrary to this world that surrounds him, or that something before imbued him with this melancholia that brought on this antagonism, we'll never know.
I think it's interesting that you use the term melancholia, and I'll have to push back on that, because I think, again, we're talking about Luciferian complex, because when you recognize that you are yourself the jewel of creation, the model by which all other animals are judged, but you still recognize that man is nothing but dust, there's no space for sentimentality. And although I love what you said, there's still so much sentimentality and melancholia, and I think Hamlet himself has surpassed that. And the reason I think I will use it even more to justify my point is the arrival of the traveling actors. And we see Hamlet for the first time show a level of jealousy, show a level of discontent towards the actor that plays a certain emotion. And I think, again, he's unable even to master that, because he's unable to feel at some point. Harold Bloom said that Hamlet is incapable of love. I'm not too sure if I can go that far, but I do think that he doesn't have melancholia or sentimentality, that he has indeed just become dust. His heart has become dust.
Well, I will fight back on that also.
We're going to push back.
I actually believe that Hamlet is incapable. I think that Hamlet is incapable of love, but that doesn't mean that I don't think that he's incapable of feeling, because again, he feels incredibly jealous. We'll talk about it, but he feels incredibly jealous. He has this need to exact vengeance, and vengeance is a very personal thing. He's not doing it. He never once mentions the crown. He never once mentions Denmark. It's a familial act that he's doing. He must feel something. The to be or not to be. He reasons himself out of his own death for a dream of something more, which may come at some point, even if that is just the excuse of this kind of double, triple think that Hamlet has to exist in, so that he can continue to live in his own melancholia, because there is this comfort in his sadness, in which many people inhabit. I still think he feels. He has to feel.
Yeah, I believe he feels too. I just don't... Yeah, it's interesting. So now we get to the traveling actors. This is a very interesting sequence that reading it again, it had a bigger impact on me than before. And I feel like you can understand a lot about Hamlet just by seeing his reaction to the play and what the play was that they were talking. And anyway, do you want to introduce a little bit and then we can discuss?
Yes, it said that there will be a play coming to entertain the court soon. And at the end of scene 2, at the end of Act 2, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern bring this troupe in. And it's a pretty ridiculous scene that occurs, really, because we're about to have in Act 3, we're about to have the famous play within the play. But before we get that, we have this quasi-rehearsal audition of the play in front of Hamlet. And it's so, in many ways, it's probably Hamlet at his most pathetic, I think.
I agree.
I think that what happens here is we've had an entire sequence in which, with Polonius, with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Hamlet has been playing, and he's been so confident in calling Polonius a fishmonger and being so witty, to the point where he's getting a bit too big for his boots, in the point that, he's mocking people, thinking that they won't even recognize the insult that he's doing. He's picking apart people. He's damning all of mankind because his friends listen to him on the behest of the king. And then all of a sudden, all this troupe comes in for this rehearsal that's about to occur, and Hamlet, for some reason, this man that only wears black, that has this dour disposition all the time, acts as though, he's this great conductor of all of these people. And it's just...
I love it. It's quite funny, actually.
It's very decadent also, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very decadent.
And this idea that, he's calling them all and like commenting on what they're wearing and pretend that he's friends with them. He doesn't know any of them. At the beginning of the play, he wasn't even sure if he knew Horatio. And now all of a sudden, he's like basically shaking hands and greeting everyone.
It's almost bipolar, because it keeps going from manic depression to like manic
and the reality
self-assurance.
The reality is that he's saying, all of this is a ploy. Is what we say about reality. You can only pretend to enjoy something so much. You can only pretend to be something so much before you actually become that.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this is with this. So,
do you know what I find it funny, particularly because he gets so impressed by the emotional performance of the actor, but I get the feeling from the way Shakespeare writes this scene that wasn't very deep at all. That it was quite foolish in a way. That wasn't even that. There was nothing to be impressed by, Well,
I think because we are essentially seeing the entirety of the play from the mind of Hamlet near enough. And so everything is siphoned and contextualized through his vision. Perhaps if we were to look at it, if our job as readers is to try and take a step back and actually examine the sequence objectively. And if you were to watch this sequence and not know the intentions and mindset of Hamlet to see him have this reaction, it would be so absurd.
Yeah.
It would be ridiculous. Because what happens is that Hamlet requests one of the players a moment from Priam in the Trojan War, and to which the player, he does a very convincing job of it. And the thing is, it's a sequence which is the longest sequence in the play. It's the longest scene of the play. And it takes us so out of what's going on.
Yeah.
It's so incongruent with the rest of the play. And something that's so discordant with the intensity of its delivery. And the time that's devoted to this little section. It's just... It's a work of fiction within the play that ultimately... its only purpose is to garner some kind of reaction from Hamlet, which it does. And it's so artificial, so much time devoted to it. I can't help but think that Shakespeare wrote nearly 40 plays in his time, revised them regularly. There's no way that he wouldn't have wrote this knowing it was his longest play, knowing that he has a section in it where it's an audition of a play within a play that goes on for so long. He had to have put this in. He had to have put this in knowing that it was something that was so different, that was so experimental, that it, whether he knew it or not, he was garnering what we would call a fourth wall break, but at the time it must have been something so much deeper to break apart the action with this sequence.
I also think you use the term avant-garde before, and I totally agree. It's extremely avant-garde, but it's also silly. And I think that's Shakespeare playing with us, because there's even the concept of the idea of all the worlds being a stage, or everything is fake, or appearances versus reality. And I think the crux of the scene is also the idea of how much of emotional truth can be betrayed by moral truth. You know, Hamlet is floating in those, what's the word? The word escaped me. He's floating in all those ideas, but he's unable to anchor himself in anything. And then he sees this play, which is quite simple, and it makes such an imprint on him that he says after, the play is the thing. I'll catch the conscience of the king. And I think the word conscience is very interestingly used.
Well, because Hamlet, so far, his de facto perspective on where he receives his truth from is something very subjective. In two instances, the first being his belief that he heard the king speak and describe everything to him, and the second one is a work of fiction. So the locations in which Hamlet has achieved these great epiphanies of truth, there's this one, which isn't real, which is someone performing, and then there's the first one, which is a ghost. And those are the things that are propelling him to take this great action against the king. And I think that, you know, that it's As You Like It, that there's the soliloquy, all the world's a play, and that soliloquy ultimately probably would have better suited Hamlet, but Hamlet I don't even think that Hamlet would have been able to express that kind of sentimentality for man that we see in As You Like It. But at the end of the sequence, after the player has done all this, Hamlet is alone again and begins to have a soliloquy. He begins to speak out loud, and he's just conversing with himself. There's a jealousy that he possesses, that the player is able to be so convincing in his passion for Hecuba, someone that doesn't exist. But what if it were to be him? There's no, according to Hamlet, there's no vessel that would even be able to adequately express the sorrow, the angst, everything that he has inside of him. And yet, he still feels jealousy. He puts himself in this lowly position to the point he starts speaking of himself in a sense of self-hatred. He starts calling himself a peasant and whatnot. But then, I have to give Hamlet some props, because although he goes through this rather pathetic, pitiable sense, we find the schism within Hamlet, because his realization of his self-awareness, that in moments of isolation, Hamlet reflects and contextualizes himself. He questions his actions as though with the passing of time, as he looks back on himself, he matures and becomes someone new. Hamlet is someone that's ever evolving. He doesn't stay in one space. He maneuvers to the point that when examining where he just was, he sees something utterly different. And he has enough wherewithal that he may even question himself. As he's gone through all of this jealousy, this pity, this anger, he's able to again reframe himself, become a new person, and have enough self-awareness to then ask himself, am I a coward? He questions himself constantly. And that is what results in this rather ingenious ploy to play out the death of the king.
It's a very overcomplicated ploy, especially when you see that in contrast to someone like Fortinbras, which I want to bring again because it's an interesting point there in the story. I think those two forces, Hamlet as thought and Fortinbras as action, they both seeking revenge in some way, but in completely different ways. Fortinbras is decisive, he's actually oriented. He is the ultimate foil to Hamlet, but he's not really, because Hamlet is so imbued in his own psyche that he's his own enemy, right? So I wonder, is Hamlet's delay a moral virtue or his tragic flaw? And I think it's both, right? There's something about him struggling between all the versions of himself, the prince Hamlet, the son Hamlet, the mourner Hamlet, the revenger now, and the madman. I mean, and now the play director Hamlet.
And so we open Act 3 with what is perhaps the most important sequence in all of literature. Claudius and Polonius employ their plan to monitor Hamlet as he interacts with Ophelia. They watch, and Hamlet enters and performs the soliloquy, which is probably best to read here so that we can discuss it. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we've shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life, for who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of unworthy takes, when he himself might make his quietus with a bare bodkin. Who would these fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sickled over with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment, with disregard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Do you have anything to say about that sequence?
Wow.
It's difficult to fully...
Nothing we say would be better than what it is.
Yeah, it's very difficult to fully comprehend why this is so important, because it ultimately grasps the great question of the human condition of life after death in and of itself. Obviously, we have the context of Hamlet, but to even perfectly summarize this idea of the point of living in its most simplistic forms.
To summarize a distortion of the idea of the point of living, I think. Because I think Hamlet's vision of existence it's again informed by what we just spoke prior, the idea of dust, the idea of nothingness. And you see it very clearly here. And I find it quite a sad it's a very sad soliloquy. And it's funny because if you asked me this years ago, I'll be like, yeah, it's amazing and it's beautiful and it's amazing and it is beautiful. But because it is so sad, because it is so solemn, I think there is this suffering within him that you get to see it for the first time a bit beyond just the madman that he's portraying to everyone. I think is the moment that you see more of him.
Well, it's because detached from Hamlet, this soliloquy works in and of itself as an exploration of life and death. When attached to Hamlet, I believe it becomes something entirely different.
Absolutely.
I think that, I mean, for me, when I analyze this through a lens of Hamlet and not Hamlet is Shakespeare and Shakespeare is understanding the human condition. But when I try to hone in on what Hamlet is doing inside his own mind, I see a transition that occurs midway throughout the soliloquy. Because when it opens, he's saying to be or not to be, the ultimate question of why go on with this? Why am I going on with this constant, what I would say, melancholia, but again, open to interpretation there, but this constant suffering that ultimately Hamlet possesses in one degree or another. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why go on with this? Why do I continue to live when I can simply end all of this immediately? And he begins the soliloquy almost as like an argumentation within himself that this idea of death, he describes it as something peaceful. Even in the first few lines, he describes it as sleep.
To sleep, yeah.
And he says sleep 4 times in the first few lines. And this repetition, it gives you this idea that there's this slow, very soft, embracing acceptance to sleep, as though he is realizing within himself a truth that this is his destiny and that he should accept this and embrace this, the way that he expresses it. And almost at that moment of complete acceptance, to die, to sleep, he then says, perchance to dream. He says, aye, there's the rub. And he references throughout the soliloquy twice. He says, there's the rub. He says, it must give us pause. As he's going through the soliloquy, he is thinking about what he's saying, because Hamlet does not want to be in that position where he has a fundamental truth and accepts it. He needs to question it. So even at that moment, the acceptance and... ultimately, you spoke about individuation earlier. What is a better individuation than the acceptance and contentment in one's own death?
But it's interesting as well because he never actually utters the I. He never utters I.
Yeah.
So there's and we know that Claudius and Polonius are watching. So there's also an element of performance in that. Whether Hamlet knows he's being watched or not, there is this element of emotional detachment when you don't use the word I. So he's still pondering. He's pondering and realizing at the same time what his situation is, but also the crux of his existence in itself. And at the same time, you can go into this downward spiral. I totally agree that he keeps pushing himself back to inaction from far, right? To the dream, which is complete subconscious, to the sleep, which is complete inaction.
Well, he says at the end, the thing is that he knows this.
Yeah.
He says the pale cast of thought, and then at the end he says, do we lose the name action? It's the fact that even with all of this, even with all of the flaws, I don't think that they're flaws within his character, because he has a profound recognition of them. He's aware of them all the time. But I think at the same time there exist these contradictions, because he says in Act 2, funnily enough, when he's speaking to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, he says, a dream is but a shadow, as though it's meaningless. And yet here, halfway through this soliloquy, he says, and yet he now asks, what dreams may come with death? As though that he would be missing out on something, that this idea of a dream, even if he's unaware of it, there is within Hamlet a real human being that craves life. He's Machiavellian, he's cold, but he is deeply fragile, and there is something within him that cannot ultimately completely disregard the humanity within him. Even if that means that by the time that he accepts it and he continues to go on live, he will continue to be Machiavellian and cold and this cruel, almost irritant within the world.
And I think his cruelty is very much shown right after with his interaction to Ophelia. I think he's extremely cruel, but at the same time, he's quite erratic, and his behavior makes you think that at that point, I noted, is he pretending to be mad, or he is mad? At this point, I think his erratic behavior is a form of exposure of his own psyche and paranoia.
I think I've never thought that the interaction between Ophelia and Hamlet that occurs, I've never thought that Hamlet is performing at this point.
Yeah.
I think that it's a sincere moment, and I think the reason it comes is because Ophelia enters almost before Hamlet has finished the soliloquy.
Yeah.
I think this is a very, very important part. And again, I don't see this mentioned. Hamlet does not finish the soliloquy when Ophelia enters. He says, we lose the name of action. And then he recognizes, says, dear Ophelia. She's there in the middle. He hasn't finished his train of thought. And so for me, because Hamlet seems to go, I mean, as you said in Act 1, he seems to go into these physical spaces in which he can be himself, he can explore. And right now, I'm convinced that Hamlet believes that he's alone. He's not aware that Claudius and Polonius are listening in on this. He doesn't know that Ophelia's been sent. And so I think that Hamlet feels at this point that he's in a physical space which is his own, and Ophelia is intruding upon him. And so I think that when Ophelia enters, she almost disrupts Hamlet mid-thought with her presence. And there's this sense that because Hamlet is so insular in his being, he cannot simply transition from one mode of thought to the next.
Yeah.
He has to put on these masks, and he has to ensure that, you know, when Polonius and the players are all there, he's playing a role, and then when they're gone, then he will transition. But he can be caught off guard because he is this theatrical, deeply feeling, deeply emotional person that does get impacted by things. So when Ophelia comes, it's like he's almost continuing the same thought process as a soliloquy upon her. And it's erratic, but it's true to him. I think.
And it's interesting because you use the idea of theater as well, because even like the symbolism of theater, the first thing that comes to mind, the idea of masks and those old archaic masks and putting on a mask and taking on a mask and putting on another mask. I think here, he's so myopic, as we mentioned many times, but that when she walks in, he's unable to move from himself to the other, from himself to perceiving her really. He perceives that she's there, almost like a side note.
Yeah, it's like, because that's the thing, you know, like there's a point where
he's so internal, right?
And he's talking at her at one point, because there's a point where he just keeps going on after he says, get thee to a nunnery. And he just keeps going on and on and on about what she is and what she represents. And she's speaking to God at this point, like heavens help him. And he just keeps going on. He repeats himself and whatnot.
I have something to consider, because I do think that Ophelia is a great manifestation of Hamlet's anima, meaning the unconscious feminine side of his psyche as a man. And I think his relationship to his anima is broken because of his mother, and then he projects all of that hatred towards Ophelia, which is in reality just an inability to really, really integrate himself. You know, I think that, and with the to be or not to be soliloquy kind of spilling on her, you know, and as I said, I do feel like their psyche mirror each other throughout the whole play. And I think there's even more reading it again.
I think that is a great way of describing it. I think that the to be or not to be soliloquy spills on her.
Yeah.
I think that's a fantastic way of visualizing it. Because what do you think about this idea that Hamlet says to Ophelia, I did love you once?
I thought about this long and deep, because everything is so about him that even when confronting her, he has to talk about himself and what he feels.
Yes, 100%.
He's so myopic of her.
Yeah.
You know, even Ophelia's tragic ending for me is even more tragic than Hamlet's ending, because she becomes the object of death, which he ponders and ponders and ponders, but ultimately she becomes that death. Hamlet even holds
I was going to say, he literally inserts himself into her death, into the grave.
Yeah, exactly, right? And again, I still feel like they mirror each other's psychic progression because of Polonius after, you know? And Hamlet is the one that takes Polonius away from Ophelia. I think this is very symbolic. I'm not entirely sure what I think exactly what it means, but I think it's extremely symbolic. And I did note that while Ophelia's grief, it's physical, and now she's grieving also Hamlet. At that point, she's grieving the loss of Hamlet, because I do feel like she loves him, although he says, I once loved you, right? I think she loves him, and she's able to love. She is inundated by feelings, and water will become a very central part of her symbolism. Hamlet is dry, dry in language even, you know?
Well, I think that, you know, very, very rarely has Hamlet witnessed any kind of reality, and I know that Ophelia is told to go to Hamlet so that Polonius and Claudius can listen to her. But I believe that she's going with a sincerity to Hamlet, expressing her feelings how she actually does feel them. She's just being used as a pawn by the court, as many of the other characters are.
Yeah.
I think that he says at the beginning, he starts proclaiming to that honesty to Hamlet. He considers honesty a far more maidenly virtue than beauty, and that's when he just coldly states, "I did love you once." I believe that Hamlet believes this, even if it may not be true. Hamlet may never once have shown any kind of sincere love to Ophelia, and yet would still proclaim something like this as truth because he can convince himself it to be.
I agree, and there's something else I want to bring. Hamlet says to Ophelia, get you to a nunnery. What is a nunnery, right? Is also, he's struggling to realize his mother's sexuality, to realize that his mother, Gertrude, might have a part to play in the whole corruption related to King Hamlet. And then he tells Ophelia, which loves him, and he's incapable to love back, perhaps even because he just sees her as a sexual object. We don't know about that. But he tells her to go to a nunnery, to forget about that side of herself, right? I find that interesting because I do feel like he struggles with female sexuality, and I think you can see that through his mother, and I think you can see that through even like Ophelia. I don't want to skip too much on Ophelia because there's so much to talk about her, but you know what I mean?
But again, it's like the way that he discusses what Ophelia should do is only through his lens.
Exactly, yeah.
It's like he has at this point, he has like equal parts self-hatred and self-righteousness, as though like his ability, he describes Ophelia as having like this wantonness for life, that she can nickname things how she wants. And because of his inability to experience that while the other person has the capacity to do that, his rational thing is to chastise her and say, "It would have been better, my mother never bore me." It's so incongruent to the rationality of how he should be dealing with the situation. And again, it's still like ciphered through his perspective. He says "I'm very proud, revengeful, ambitious, with more offences at my beck than I have thought to put them in, imagination to give them shape, or time to act them in. What such fellows as I do crawling between heaven and earth, we are arrant knaves all, believe none of us." He begins to talk about her, and then he just talks about how awful a person he is, as though he's just being overwhelmed with this sudden dissatisfaction of life. And it's funny because a moment ago he's just convinced himself in his own soliloquy of the ability to continue to dream, that there is this other country of which none of us have returned to, and that fear that we have, it's better that it actually is worth suffering through the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, because we know not what lies beyond, whether it's something, whether it's nothing. And now all of a sudden, being interrupted, letting that spill onto Ophelia because of what she represents, he comes to a new conclusion, that it was better his mother had never bore him.
It just occurred to me as well, even in relation to what Hamlet feels for his father's death, it's also all about what makes him feel.
Exactly.
It's always about him.
Yeah, exactly. The revenge plot has...
What occurs to me, Hamlet,
yeah,
right?
The revenge plot has nothing to do with the crown. It has nothing to do with what is right for the people, even though Horatio, the most level-headed person, the one that actually is loyal to him, that speaks of the crown, he never once sees this as a moral injustice because of the family. And even the family, the parents of Hamlet, never speak of the love they have towards Hamlet at all, and yet he's completely obsessed with it. And his father, if it is true, he just wants vengeance because his father has been unjustly cut down. Not because of the king, not because of his son, not because of anything. But then, after this, Polonius and Claudius hear all of this. After Ophelia leaves, they hear what's been spoken between the two. And then they decide, okay, something must be done about this. He truly is mad. Polonius utters before leaving, "Madness and great ones must not unwatched go." And then the stage is set for the play to occur, the Mousetrap, which is concocted by Hamlet, called the Mousetrap because it's a play that he hopes to catch a rat with. The perspective of the play is one that morally seems to criticise the role of the player queen, but would you like to speak a bit about how the play unfolds, about what it is?
No, you can introduce that. I'm happy to comment after, to be honest. I don't have any notes on that.
Well, I mean, what happens here is Hamlet has essentially guided the players, and just before the play enacts, it does feel again as though Shakespeare has inserted himself into this, because Hamlet plays the role of the director. He's telling the actors what to convey, the importance of it. You can't not consider the fact that Shakespeare is putting himself in this.
It's another play also, I think, on the role of an artist, the self-obsession of an artist as well, in the case here of a playwright. And Hamlet's obsession with himself to the point that he cannot externalize his thoughts to others properly, and he feels like this is the only way that he can actually show Claudius what he actually feels as well, because there is a trap, but also is a way of him showing his version of the story, is a way of him showing what he sees that have happened, right? His vision, I suppose. What do you think, again, going back to the first conversation we had on Act 1, about the idea of the artist as the quintessential Lucifer, right? Even Lucifer himself was a musician, the way he was created by God. And the idea that the devil cannot create, just replicate, right? Copy. And Hamlet here, again, he's using the play as a method of not storytelling, but to create something that is not even the thing itself.
It's manipulation. It's manipulation. And of course, there's the archetype of that, because there's a kind of alchemy that we envision in the arts, because you're taking reality and warping it in some way. And in many ways, that kind of alchemical process is seen as a bit profane, because you're not doing something real. It's like black magic, that you can extrapolate it from its reality and reach that. So it makes sense that why Hamlet is and has more artistry in him than more pragmatism, because it suits his demeanor.
But there's also the realization that everyone is acting. Perhaps Hamlet is the master of that, in the sense that he can then own it and create something new with that acting, because he understands that he's acting. He's self-aware, and he's able to direct the actors. But Claudio is acting. He's acting, I said to you, I think he's an extremely diplomatic king, in the way that he knows what's going on with Fortinbras advancing towards Denmark, but he chooses to be very diplomatic about it. He's very pious as a king. He is very pompous. He plays his part very well, which in reality is hiding his Cain and Abel type of murder that is happening behind the scenes. Gertrude plays the dutiful queen, even though she might even be a manipulative Lady Macbeth type of character. We don't know, right? Then Ophelia performs her obedience daughter. She participates as a pawn. Hamlet is just showing all those meta theater things that are already happening inside the life of those characters. And when he says, there's something, okay, I don't want to advance too much, but I think this scene, particularly Hamlet, is so decadent, the way he acts here.
Yeah, he is, yeah. I think one of the most interesting aspects of this scene is what he does with Ophelia, in that he lies in her lap, and whatever reasoning you surmise that he's doing this, it's so inhuman, whatever the reason would be. Either he's lying in Ophelia's lap because he's completely disregarded in the previous scene the way he spoke to her, the things that he said to her, and he's just willing to do it because she's an object of it. He knows that she has some desire towards him, and he's okay using her for that. Or the alternative, which is close to what I think, is that just prior to this, Gertrude tells Hamlet to come sit by her side.
Exactly.
And then he goes to Ophelia's lap as another kind of manipulative tactic that he's just using Ophelia in other terms to instill some kind of jealousy in his mother.
I think there is. And it's very childlike to sit and lay his head on her lap. It's very childlike, something that you do as a kid to your mother's lap. I think that too.
Yeah.
That he does it in a way, it's quite decadent to see a man do that.
Well, I wanted to actually ask you, because you were speaking about Claudius, what do you think of this idea? Because the play, the Hamlet calls the mousetrap. The play unfolds and it essentially reenacts the events that occurred between Claudius and the deceased king as a mode to expose the truth, and Hamlet wants to gauge the reaction of Claudius in the hope that it reveals the truth. And the reality is that it does reveal the truth. What do you think about the idea that the mousetrap, the trap is sprung, it captures what Hamlet sought out to do, but it managed to do it too well in the sense that the prey got away. It didn't actually capture him. It just revealed a truth that Hamlet was already told was true anyway. He was convinced it was true. He believed his father. He wanted to do it, but then required this to go through. What do you think about the reaction of Claudius, in which he says, "Light, light"? That he requires light to illuminate the room again, and then they all leave. That he can't take it.
Yeah, the darkness of the unconscious. He's unconscious at that moment, I think, because what the play does is brings it to him again, the truth of what happened. And I think the lie symbolizes a moment of like break from that unconscious, that memory going in my head, and bring me back to the court. I don't want to see the play anymore. I don't want to see the memory play in my head. I want to see the light. I want to see the court. I want to see my social status. I want to see the people around me. I want to not be trapped within my subconscious. That's how I take it. But then again, it's also, everyone else is not as deep as Hamlet.
Yeah.
So he might just be saying, stop this bullshit. I don't want to participate in it. He might be saying, lie, because I don't want it anymore.
But we do
He's
know,
the king after all.
Yes, but we do know, because of the following scene, that he's praying and he's reflecting on what happens. And then Hamlet actually has the opportunity to kill Claudius. He's right behind him, but he takes out his sword, but then sheathes it. Because he believes that whether this is a moral thing or whatnot, that this vengeance isn't sufficient enough, because it has to be, quote, he would say, in his incestuous bed. That would be the only thing worthy, because then that would send him to hell, and his mother could still stay here.
I know, and I want to think about that with you together, because I didn't make any note about that, but now when you bring it up, it's like, why does he want to spare his mother, and why this obsession of seeing them in an incestuous bed? And we know it's also because he, in a way, he doesn't want his conscience to be clean. He wants him to be damned.
It can't be denied. I think the complication of confusing the Oedipal complex with Hamlet is this idea that the reasoning that Hamlet is going through these actions is because he wants to have sex with his mother. However, the reality is that Hamlet has not a fully formed vision of who his mother actually is as a fully sexualized adult.
Yeah.
Like she is only the mother archetype, and that's very interesting, because Hamlet has such a deep perception of the whole world that it is interesting that he has such, I would agree with you on this, such an arrested development phase of the relationship with his mother. And
I would argue that no one can be completely fully integrated without both feminine and masculine. So I think Hamlet is not completely fully integrated. And I think his idea of wanting Claudius to die in sin is very righteous from Hamlet. Who does he think he is? Like he never sinned. We all sin.
Yeah.
You know? And it's again, the play, him directing the play is a way of play God as well. Of trying to cause the situation to go. And I wonder, how did he actually thought it was going to end? That Claudius was just going to say, I did it, you know, in his own mind. how did he thought he could actually expose him? Like,
It's
almost like he doesn't realize that people have a subconscious of their own.
He says the play will be the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king, but what he exactly means by that we're uncertain, because he also said to his father that this will be the commandment that takes place in his mind, unmixed with anything baser. It will be the only focus for him. And then he has the opportunity to kill Claudius. It's not enough. You can come up with infinite reasons for it, and they all make sense to Hamlet. But I couldn't officially say there is one reason. Because I'll say this as well. What's the point, immediately after this, what's the point that Hamlet is going to Gertrude's chambers for? Hamlet goes to see Gertrude. Why at that point?
Yeah, it's very odd.
There's no reason why he goes there. Polonius is in there, and then he knows that Hamlet's coming in there. But there's no...
And also, why Polonius there? I know, I'm just joking.
But Polonius is like a kind of crafty, conniving character.
Yeah.
He's always eavesdropping. He's always trying to get people to do one thing. I don't think that he's necessarily like a rat within the court, but it gives the impression that the court is filled with conspirators and people that are artificial people.
Could we also infer that he's also in his mother's chamber by any other reason, that his mother being even more impure than we imagine? I don't know. Something to think about.
There's there's the obvious inference with that. And what ends up happening is that when Hamlet goes into Gertrude's chambers, Gertrude for a brief moment actually thinks that Hamlet is capable of murdering her. And then she screams out for help. Polonius then also screams out for help because of this. And Hamlet stabs him through the curtains, not knowing who it is.
It's very dark.
Which is so erratic.
Yeah,
again.
It's
completely erratic from Hamlet. He's had the opportunity to kill Claudius. He goes into the chambers. He is convinced. I mean, even that is relating completely to what you're saying. He kills a man who's hiding behind the curtains of his mother's chambers, which might be a place in which, an adult son also shouldn't be inside his mother's chambers. And he sees the man there, recognizes that it's Polonius, and again, like before, doesn't come to the conclusion that his mother may have been doing something improper with anyone else.
Yeah.
He doesn't reach this conclusion.
I find that very bizarre. But at the same time, he's so adamant that he wants Claudius to die in sin, in a sinful act.
But
like his mother wouldn't she be in sin too?
But that's what I'm saying.
Can you not see that?
But that's what I'm saying. So even in this instance, because he starts cursing out Polonius at this point of what he's doing there, but doesn't transfer this to his mother. It's an undeniably salient aspect to Hamlet's psychology that he's not consciously protective of his mother, but he's disregarding of his mother in any kind of sinful or immoral action.
Well, Freud actually, he said that he believed that Hamlet was a modern manifestation of Oedipus because he doesn't act on his desire. He represses it, which is what Freud would say that although the modern man represses his desires, Oedipus in the original play acts upon it. It's a bit different. So that was Freud's assertion, which I think is quite interesting. I don't feel like Hamlet feels like that for his mother, but at the same time, there's too much symbolism to deny it, right?
Yes, it's...
I mean, he's fixated on her in some way or another.
Yes, yeah.
Freud's fixations are something that forms our sexual desires, right?
Yeah,
so.
It is something that cannot be avoided when you look at it. It's an incredibly strong element. But then at the finale of the act, something else happens, which is that the ghost reappears once again in the chambers upon the death of Polonius. And in many ways, the expected thing happens. In the Hamlet, in the presence of the ghost in both sequences, to me, is completely open with the ghost. He has no power over the ghost. He comes across as completely powerless. He comes across as a child. He he doesn't feel a child to Gertrude. He feels as a protector, as like the man in her life, you know, equal to her. But in the presence of the ghost, he feels like a submissive child. He seems infantile. You have this impression that he's looking up to the ghost, that the ghost is so much larger than him.
Because he's the ghost of his father, and he's so much larger than him, and he will ever be. Like,
but would his mother ever be that? Could his mother ever be that?
Perhaps, but it not in the same sense. I think this is a very complex question.
I think the obvious thing happens ultimately at the end of this act, in which the ghost is there, and again, no one can hear it, but this time Gertrude can't even see it.
Yeah.
So why would that be?
Yeah, I think there's a level of like, she replaced him, the king. She replaced her king husband for a new king, his brother. I
think if we're relating it to earlier, we spoke of this idea of the organ that's acted upon as a sense of injustice, and the idea that the king was poisoned in his ear by Claudius, and that is the reason within Hamlet that of course Hamlet can hear him, because woe is me that I have to outlive my father with my organs still intact, that I'm able to hear when my father could no longer hear. He was so unjustly deceived through this organ. There is the idea that perhaps the subconscious of Hamlet is also manifesting here. Perhaps it's not that the ghost appeared, it's that perhaps the ghost was manifested by Hamlet's psyche, that he can see it, and perhaps it's Hamlet's subconscious here attempting to reason with him, to look at his mother for once in a rational sense. Because if he came to the if we're going by what we said, if we came to the conclusion that of course, yes, the reason that he can hear his father is because of this, is because of a manifestation of this injustice that Hamlet feels, because Hamlet's truth is all truth.
To him is all truth. Yeah.
Only what he sees, and that is ultimate truth. Yeah. Even his subconscious is trying to tell him to look at his mother in a new way. Because if he were to apply that same logic, then why is it that his mother can't see? It's because that is the sinful organ that his mother had while his father was alive. She could see what was going on. She could see the manipulation that was going on. She knew what Claudius was. She could see that Claudius all this time has been the one to cut down his own father, and that is why through the cosmos has punished Gertrude by not being able to see the ghost. That is her punishment, that she cannot see the truth, because Hamlet can see the truth, and yet in Hamlet's own self-reasoning and his inability to view his mother through any kind of correct lens, he cannot come to that conclusion.
I agree, and I'll add to that, not only her sinful organ is the eye, but the idea of the spiritual connection and the symbolism of the ear being also the path to the brain, to the subconscious. We talk about that when we talk about Blue Velvet in the deep dive. This idea that the ears are the path to the innermost subconscious. It's almost like Hamlet doesn't even see that his mom has an inner life.
And so we reach the penultimate act, Act 4, which is the most convoluted act. It has the most scenes throughout it, and many of them are very brief, and it essentially is setting the stage for the finale. There are 4 or 5 very, very quick scenes which are essentially propelling the narrative forward here. We begin in the first scene in which we see Gertrude approaching Claudius, telling him of what Hamlet has done in that he's killed Polonius, and that she essentially gives Hamlet up to Claudius, and she's allying herself with him against her son, essentially. She describes Hamlet as mad as the sea and wind when both contend which is the mightier. And then Claudius in turn asks Hamlet to be sent away to England. This can be viewed as a protective aspect, like a fatherly aspect from Claudius. However, I don't think that that's the case at all. I think that this is a means in which Claudius is attempting to retain his power, because throughout all of this, a murder has occurred. He's not relatively concerned with Polonius, and he also doesn't at any point ask about Gertrude, about her safety.
Yeah, I think she's acting out of self-interest by basically betraying betraying her son's interest by talking to Claudius, right? I think because she could have protected Hamlet and not have said anything. They're both acting of self-interest, I think. I wonder, I didn't make a lot of notes about her exposing Hamlet in a way. What do you think? Because could it be not just self-interest, but also in a way trying to protect Hamlet from himself?
No, I don't think that at all.
I think it's more self-interest.
I think the nature of what we've seen from Gertrude thus far, and especially the relationship of both Gertrude and the king to Hamlet, I don't think either of them have actually thought of Hamlet at any point throughout this. I think that might be the one sympathetic aspect that we do have to Hamlet, because he is essentially motherless and fatherless. They have cared for their own self-interests all the way throughout this. And, I'm inclined to believe that they've always been that way and probably done that throughout his childhood also. The fact that even if Gertrude knew nothing of Claudius's ploy to kill the king, the fact that she was so quick to ally with Claudius and then also ally with him against Hamlet speaks more towards her position as the queen, because when Prince Hamlet becomes king, she is no longer the queen. She's the mother of the king.
Yeah, it's true, actually. Her position of power shifts, right?
And
I mean, it's totally of her self-interest to keep that position.
There's also no love ever spoken of between Gertrude and Claudius either. We don't hear.
That's true.
Even at this point, I mean, the idea that there has been a murder in the presence of his wife, he doesn't question her, and she also doesn't take offense to the idea that Claudius doesn't act as the protector. The irony being is that Hamlet is this overbearing protector of Gertrude, which she doesn't seem to care about either. I think that both of them are acting in a way so that both can retain the power that they currently have.
Yeah, because it's easy to see them as duty-bound, but they're actually more self-interest bound than anything. Like, they're thinking of themselves and their position, their social status, and how that's going to impact them. I think Hamlet, it's how he's going to reflect on them, not just how he is a danger to perhaps even Claudius' life. Because I don't necessarily think that he's so afraid of Hamlet doing something to him. I actually think he's quite incapable.
Who?
I think Claudius thinks that Hamlet is not that capable.
I think that after the killing of Polonius, there's an awareness, which is why he sent him away to England. But I mean, the guise of it, we see Hamlet. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are sent to actually retrieve Hamlet, and we see him disposing of the body of Polonius, in which he says safely stowed, like it's some cargo. And then Rosencrantz and Guildenstern confront him, and by the time that they arrive and speak to Hamlet, at this point in the play, it really seems as though he's just gone. He has foregone any kind of sanity, and he does come across as insane at this point, although it's still within the same musings that he discusses anything. When they ask him about where Polonius is and where the king is, he says, the body is with the king, but the king is not with the body. And then he starts describing that the king is a thing, and he's going to go off on one again.
I know.
And then they just interrupt him, essentially to be confronted for the first time with a "what are you talking about" kind of thing. Can you not comprehend the veracity of the situation that you're in? Can you not understand how important these events are that you're causing? And then to that, rather than carrying on this contemplation, which he would have done, he recognizes it and then just runs away. He just runs. This is the point of the the point of the play where we have to realize that whether he is play acting or not, there is a vein of insanity, of sheer high self-awareness, but lack of general awareness that Hamlet has, because his actions here are the actions of a madman.
Yeah, he's acting like a maniac at this point. And in contrast, you have Claudius keeping this weird composure, I think, over the situation. I said it before, but I think his diplomacy in acting towards everything, even when he's conniving and strategizing things behind the scenes, I feel like he has this theatricality, which might not be as theatrical and maniacal as Hamlet, but he is playing something as well. He is strategizing behind the scenes. He is making it so things are not what they seem as well. It's just that his way of doing that is not considered inappropriate by polite society. He's doing it by the book. He's doing things here and there. Like, it's a contrast between, like, how do you say it? A crisis management. He goes into crisis management mode.
But also, isn't that the duty of a king?
Exactly, yeah. It's the duty of a king. But also, it keeps him in the position of a king, because he also could lose everything. Yeah.
Both things are true, but the essence would still stand, that Claudius is doing what ultimately, he's playing his role. We said this at the beginning. He's doing what he should be doing, ultimately. Yeah. There is eventually, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern do catch up with Hamlet, and they bring him to Claudius. And then Claudius says, he's speaking to Hamlet, he's saying to him, as your loving father and whatnot. That's why he'll send him away to England. And Claudius doesn't really think that.
No.
I don't think that Hamlet actually thinks on what Claudius thinks of him. I don't think that, Claudius saying your loving father to Hamlet, I don't think that Hamlet has once throughout the play contemplated what Claudius actually thinks, because Hamlet's vision is exclusive to Hamlet's vision.
But I think it's not just Claudius. I think we touched that when we talk about his relationship to Ophelia. I think he doesn't think about anyone else other than himself. If anything, the other person that he thinks a bit more in an idealized sense is his father, and in a smaller sense his mother. But even so, he doesn't really think of them as people that have feelings, that go through emotional changes just as him. He sees them as archetypes almost,
Well, it's funny because within the scene where they're trying to tell Hamlet that it's in his best interest to go to England, and they're asking him where Polonius's body is, and he's again with this mockery saying that he's being digested by worms, and he sends the guards off to find the body. He then says, as your loving father and whatnot. Hamlet then responds, he refuses to acknowledge Claudius's feigned attempts at parenthood by still displaying this ongoing obsession with his mother. He says, father and mother is man and wife. Man and wife is one flesh, and so mother. And that's how he refers to them. He thinks of them both collectively as mother.
Yeah. He neutralizes the paternal figure of Claudius by doing that, and by, in a weird way, he also puts himself in that place.
I don't think he does. If he does, then the only conclusion would be that it is a repression, but I wouldn't necessarily refute that. I don't think that's out of the option, because Hamlet has an incredible and adept ability at convincing himself of something that he doesn't even truly believe. I think Hamlet has the capacity to repress something within himself that is there, and he can do it with absolute certainty.
And it's interesting because Polonius dies, and I mean, at any point, no one cares about Ophelia's feelings or Laertes' feelings. Like, nobody even questions what's going to happen to them. Everyone's so self-involved, self-absorbed even. And Hamlet, at that point, he had the upper moral ground when talking about King Claudius, because we believe that Claudius did indeed kill his brother, right? We believe with Hamlet.
Yeah.
He's convincing enough, and I actually believe that he did. And I think also his reaction towards the play is a way of Shakespeare telling that he actually did it. But rather than a feeling of guilt or even a feeling that I have sinned, I am also in the same moral ground now because I committed murder as well.
Well, Hamlet
doesn't feel that. He still feels self-righteous.
Yeah. The irony would be that Hamlet has now put himself. Well, he's put Laertes and Ophelia in the same position that he was. He's taken a father away the same way that Claudius took his father away, but he does not acknowledge it at all. But Claudius also has a completely myopic lens. Claudius, when he has his own soliloquy and he has this fervent desire to quell this pest that is Hamlet. He professes, he says, "For like the hectic in my blood he rages, and thou must cure me," when speaking of England. So for him, with all of this that's going on around Claudius, Hamlet is this thing that rages inside of him. He describes him as in his bloodstream. He equally has as obsessive a nature. And we can't forget that ultimately what Claudius is a man who is willing to murder his own kin. Again, referring to the Cain and Abel biblical story. He's willing to commit an ultimate sin, a moral sin, in order to reclaim some kind of earthly power. And with that becomes an obsessive, extreme lens. It just happens to be one that cannot keep up with Hamlet, although he professes an inkling of it here with the obsession that he has to also not necessarily exact revenge on Hamlet, but he displays a willingness to do anything to be rid of him.
I wonder why.
Because he's a murderer. He is, for all intents and purposes, an evil, amoral character. And if we were to see things from his perspective, as much as we see from Hamlet's, I don't know if it would elucidate any further truth.
I think in Act 3 we glance over that a little bit, but he does call his predicament, Claudius says, the primal eldest curse, referring to, in my opinion, to the Cain and Abel parallel between his story with King Hamlet and between those two stories. I'm not necessarily completely convinced that he would have that rich of an inner life to know his moral standing so much, because he seems so intertwined with his social status.
Well, I think he has a richness of his inner life. However, it's just more repressed than a Hamlet's would be, because we do see moments of introspection in which he has desire, even if it is surface level desire, because what he ultimately wants is the ongoing reclamation of his own power. But I still think that Claudius has some depth to him. It's just much more simplified, because unlike Hamlet, Claudius is someone that has a vision and has an answer to what his goal on this earth is. Hamlet innately convinces himself that to the point that there could be no such thing as a goal, that we are everlastingly wandering creatures.
Yeah, in a sense, Claudius has something to fall back to in case he wanders, right?
Yeah, and well, I think this is a good time, because what happens next should be touched upon briefly, because Hamlet does sail to England with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern accompanying him. And then this Deus Ex Machina occurs, where for unknown reasons, with no causality whatsoever, the ship that he is on is overtaken by pirates, and he convinces them, which I can believe, to send him back to Denmark. And so he will be returning to Denmark, and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are going to take his place to go to England. Whether he thought that, again, a kind of poetic justice for their betrayal of him, we don't know. But there is this kind of out of the blue intervention that occurs. I don't know if it's a divine intervention, that Hamlet will be returning back to Denmark. What do you think about this?
I think we touched upon this in the beginning when we said that it's almost like he knew that he was destined to be in Denmark and never get well. that his life would be that his life is too intertwined now with the ghost of his father, literally. Yeah.
The reality is that he's left Denmark primarily because he's a murderer, and for his own survival, he should be away from Denmark. He shouldn't be returning. And yet again, I do think that Hamlet does have a death drive. I think he talks himself into situations in which he can reach death, in which he is an inch away from death. And I think that him returning to Denmark is also that, because even the idea that they would continue to go on to England or that he would go into further hiding, he convinced the pirates. I'm certain by that standard he probably would have been able to do anything, and yet he returns to the place which is the most dangerous for him, which is the place that he's very likely to die.
Well, you said that you believe that Hamlet has a death drive.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And I think this is a proof in the text that he does have, because what other reason? I mean, he does swear revenge, even bloody revenge, but at the same time, he can talk himself to do anything.
Well, think about it. We'll get onto it when we reach Act 5. But by the time he returns to Denmark, his entire motive has changed. He sees Ophelia, and then it's as though the vengeance against Claudius dissipates and just randomly reemerges in his mind's eye when he's disposed of Laertes, when he realizes it. He is, just as I said, he's an ever-evolving person. He looks upon where he just was in the previous moment and sees someone entirely new. It's, in many ways, it's like Hamlet is just a vessel, and it's the psychology of the person that exists. And because it's changed into something new, because it has new insight, because it has new thoughts, it's as though he looks back on what was before. It may as well be a completely new person. But I think because ultimately we're setting the stage for the finale, I think we should discuss the climax of this act, which is the resolution of Ophelia's place in the narrative, in which Ophelia, having discovered that Polonius has been murdered by the man that she professed to love, who has also completely tormented her in the previous acts, completely loses her mind. She becomes mad.
I find it interesting. I think we've been touching upon this throughout the whole conversation. This idea that Ophelia and Hamlet mirror each other. I think that their two descent into madness is pretty much parallel, The difference is, I think, that Ophelia doesn't seem to have that much impact on Hamlet as Hamlet has on Ophelia. Well, he kills her father, he, in that moment, right in the to be or not to be, the end of the soliloquy, he destroys her. Like, it's such a cruel thing to do, to the point that she loses her ability to speak coherently. I think that the fact that Shakespeare uses music is a way to touch completely on the subconscious, because when you just speak is also to be completely in contrast to Hamlet, because as I said before, as Ophelia loses the ability to speak coherently in her madness, Hamlet seems to become increasingly more verbal, more rational, more self-aware, and more philosophical. We see it as madness because those are two polarities of it, right? But they are the same state, but different manifestations of it. What do you think about the flowers as a recurring theme with her from the beginning to now? Because to me, it's quite a bit on the nose, but the idea of also the flowering of a woman?
I've never thought of it like that. My thing is just, I think that this is an archetype. I think imagetically this is something that Shakespeare was drawn to. You can see it in King Lear. The associations of King Lear is also a man who is on a hillside with flowers as he has also descended into madness. There's something about a juxtaposition with the delicacy of a garden. I think probably It's more to do with the connotations of
The Garden of Eden.
No, I think it's more to do with the connotations of the female psyche. I think this idea of the playfulness, of the wistfulness, you associate with, you know, the freedom and wanton carefree attitude of playing in a meadow. And when you associate that with a man, it becomes more violently maddening. Whereas with Ophelia, she's also still to this day in many ways the archetypal feminine.
Yeah.
Even in her falls into madness.
Yeah, she her grief is physical, right? Like she's not as rational as Hamlet, so that's a way of her externalizing what she feels inside. But I do think there's a sense of liberation in the archetype of the flower as well, not just the whimsical aspect of it, but the sexual aspect of it, of a flower also symbolizing something of the sexual feminine. And I wouldn't say that normally, because this is a very abnormal reading for me. I don't normally tend to read things like that. But as I see her as an anima counterpoint for Hamlet, I think it's impossible to not mention the sexual repression that she experienced and she had to experience here. And there's something about the fact that she drowns. For me, it's not just imagetically beautiful. Like an image of a woman dead like that is very elusive, yeah? But also just the symbology of the water and what the water represents in the feminine is always been a symbol of feminine fluidity. And there's even a point that I don't want to skip too much ahead, but that her brother mentions the idea that where is it that he says? I have it here written down. Alice, she's drowned. Too much of water has thou, poor Ophelia. And he says that he's not going to shed a tear because it's too much water. And I just see this as like, you know how in Angel's Egg, the water symbolizes everything that is fertile, everything that is feminine. I think obviously this is much older, but I think this has been an archetype of the night, of the feminine for ages. And as Hamlet is drowning in his own mad rationalism, his own philosophical existentialism, she is drowning in complete incoherence, you know? And I see those two paralleling each other. I find her story, particularly in reading again, the most tragic of them all. Because I think she's so innocent. Like, you know, she's obedient to her father. She's obedient to her brother. She does what she's told. She loves him. You know, I don't know. I know we spoke about this before. That do you think that he loved him? We spoke about this, but I think the question is, do you think she loved him?
Yes.
I think she did.
I want to ask you something. What do you think it ultimately means, the fact that Ophelia's madness is portrayed in the musicality, in her dumbness, in her inability to convey things through speech, whereas Hamlet is someone that speaks perhaps far too well?
I think that they both been arrested in the development, her towards the feminine, repressed towards her, having to abandon the man that she loved and having lost her paternal figure by the hands of the man she loved. So there is a disassociation of like being able to be feminine and be a woman and become a woman. And Hamlet's the same towards the other side. He loses his anchor, his father, and he has to replace him so fast. His idea of his mother is broken, and I think they're both going towards the two archetypes completely lost. And her, I like the term dominance actually, because it's interesting because it almost means this like lack of astuteness, but I don't think she is that at all.
Do you think that she has any agency over her cognition?
I think she's just pure emotion. And the only way that she can express then her emotions is through music, because the rational at that point doesn't matter. She's imbued in feminine unconscious and feminine illogic, and that's why Hamlet speaks so much, because he's pure rational at that point, even though he's not really rational. Okay, that's why I think it's interesting, because he is manifesting something extremely masculine even though the text is very beautiful, it's very masculine to think.
Yes.
And to think yourself into things, into rationalize. And this is, I mean, I am going very like ancient archetypes here, because I think this is what Shakespeare, because that's the thing about Shakespeare, we haven't spoke about this, but he knew people more than anyone. And to know people is to know the ancient archetypes, you know, understand that, even if it wasn't, even if he didn't study that himself, I mean, he understood it, he saw through it. Yeah, he saw those patterns of recognition between people and how people react and how people act. And he was able to write that better than anyone, even today.
Yeah.
You know? So yeah, I think the music is that complete lack of rationality, because even in her speech, she has no rationale.
I think what's interesting is that matching like Macbeth, the death of Ophelia occurs like the death of Lady Macbeth, in that it's reported to someone else, we don't see it.
Yeah.
And I think that we see a prelude to Lady Macbeth's death. However, there's something about Ophelia in which the last thing that we see her is singing nonsensically, saying, "Hey, nonny, nonny." And then even Gertrude, the way that she reports it is incredibly tragic. It's as though she feels a sentimentality that something has been lost here. But I think that even the idea that the manner in which she died, well, there's also the mystery. We don't know if she killed herself. We don't know if she stumbled. And this is a very important part, because this becomes in the next act, which we can speak more on. But this idea that she died completely alone, but then by doing this, she was also cast into this myth. The irony being this myth of something that she wasn't, which again is a recurrent theme that will come through the end. We speak about this, about the death of Claudius and whatnot, of he is an idealized version because he was cast down in his prime, and so he will forever be a legend. He will forever be a hero, an icon of a time when we know nothing about him. If he comes across anything like his ghost does, then he was probably an incredibly domineering patriarchal figure that showed no love whatsoever, but people won't remember him as that. And it's the same with Ophelia. We may remember her now, but what truly was she? Because all we've seen of her was, like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, was just this vessel in which people used Hamlet, Claudius, even her own father Polonius. The only one ultimately who ever showed some affection for her was Laertes, who was warning her at the beginning. And the irony was that it seemed as though that was the one person's advice she should have taken, but didn't ultimately, because she was still falling for Hamlet, even though everyone, including Hamlet himself, was basically ensuring that she shouldn't be anywhere near him. And yet Hamlet was resting his head on her lap. People were pushing her. So when she wanted to get away from him, and Laertes was the one telling her, everyone else was pushing her towards him.
And I do agree with you that she becomes in death something that she wasn't in life. And I think even that will come to be even more important in the scene where Hamlet throws himself to her body, like when she's being buried. I think the idea of a perfect woman at that point, almost, because he is unable to see her in life. But at that point, it's so random that he does that. You know, it feels very random, but it's not. Especially if we look through that perspective of his anima and incorporating the anima. Well, if she is the projection of that, and she's alive and she's becoming a person of her own, she cannot be that really for him in time, right? But that she can be perfect as well. And I think it's very interesting because her image, even as much as Hamlet's image, has been also immortalized through paintings, through pop culture. Yeah,
but it's her death that has immortalized her, and yet she's such a rich person, and yet when we think of Ophelia, we think of her immortalized as this maddened and a woman with no agency, a woman who has been completely overtaken by her own subconscious, by her own emptiness, to the way that we and all the world have immortalized her. is essentially as nothing more than a cadaver. And so we reach the final act of William Shakespeare's Hamlet, and we continue on immediately after the death of Ophelia to a time in which Ophelia's funeral is ongoing. However, we open the scene in a fantastically brilliant fashion, and we are encountering two characters that have never been mentioned in this play. They don't even exist within the world or the social status of these characters. We encounter two clowns, two grave diggers that are in the midst of digging a grave, but they're discussing the events that have been going on. And this, to me, is very reminiscent of how the film opens.
The play. I was going to say the same thing.
Sorry, the play. Yeah, excuse me. Of this idea that we sometimes forget that when we're so entrenched in this tunnel vision that is Hamlet, that a world exists on the outskirts that's ultimately far more powerful, has far more sway over what Hamlet will do than he would care to admit. And we see these two people, and it's kind of like a snapback to reality of how the common man infers the goings-on of what's occurring. They are discussing the death of Ophelia, and they're doing it in a way in which, because they have no reverence to Ophelia, they're speaking of her as though she were anyone else. And they're doing it with wit, they're doing it with dark humor, but it's also with a surprising degree of insight. They speak of her death, of whether she drowned or whether she killed herself. And then they are coming with like these logical loops of if water approaches a person or a person approaches water.
I know.
And the irony is that this is what Hamlet does.
I literally, we have the same point.
Yeah.
I love the gravediggers. They are actually, I really like how Shakespeare writes the working class. I think he writes them with such humanity, like more than at the time they were being portrayed.
Yeah, they have an internal world and an agency and a disposition all of their own.
Yeah, and it's very funny when you think also like the people that will come, people of all sorts of class will come to see Shakespeare plays, and it's interesting to see how he would portray all those people from different social status as well. And I wrote the same thing, that they're doing the Hamlet thing, the to be or not to be soliloquy, but for the working class.
Yeah.
They are doing that conversation. They're debating the crucial morality of her death, even. Like, the moral stance of her death. Like, she should have a funeral, or she should not. It's hilarious. It's very funny.
There is a subtle indicator that, it's as though they actually see far clearer the events that went on, even though they weren't there, than everyone else who was very present in the moment, because they do state, if she were a lowly born person, she wouldn't have had any kind of Christian burial, and they weren't even present, and they're aware of that. And it's this irony that Shakespeare understands that people within certain milieus that can't escape their own vision that they deem is so true, so absolute, that all it takes is just a moment of rationality, a moment of common sense.
A different perspective from a common sense, yeah.
It's just common sense. But what I do also thoroughly enjoy about this as a narratively, as a setting for the climax, is that there is an imagetic sense of drama here, which I really like. The idea that these two gravediggers are, it's like the calm before the storm. We're spending time with people away from the story, and there is this excitement that we know we are on the precipice of something great coming, because Hamlet is coming back, and now we're just with gravediggers, and we're surrounded by death. And Hamlet is nowhere to be seen. And then all of a sudden, we know that Hamlet is emerging. He's coming over the horizon. He's arriving back home. And of all the people, he has Horatio by his side.
Yeah.
Horatio has returned. And it's as though it feels as though that this is in many ways a last stand for Hamlet, whether he knows it or not. I think that subconsciously he must know that he's going towards his own death. And it feels like that. I mean, we are in a graveyard, and he has the final man that will stand by him. And so it feels as though, perhaps with Horatio, he finally has some tether to the rational world with him. But unfortunately, the first people he encounters are the lonely born clowns, the gravediggers, who do not know Hamlet. And so they treat him like anyone else.
Well, they speak of Hamlet, but not knowing it's him. I really like that.
They know of him. They know who he is. But when he's in their presence, it doesn't matter to them.
And
they don't know him.
And the irony that the gravediggers will probably dig his grave and bury him.
There is a moment, actually. When Hamlet first encounters the gravediggers, he's asking about what kind of whose grave that they're digging, and he's saying he does something very Hamlet-esque, in which he says, "My grave," and he's asking why. He says, "Because I'm in it," and this is a dismissal of another person, but not in a cold way that Hamlet would do. But it's as though Hamlet, finally escaping the circle in which he exists in, has been out-Hamleted by the first person outside of that circle that he's encountered.
Yeah, people that have true life experience as well, we must say as well, because if the pompous court feels perhaps stifling to Hamlet's intellect, perhaps real life with real people, the working class, normal people, as you said, with common sense and wit, maybe that's the only thing. And around a place of death, which, everyone calls death the great equalizer. There's no social standing with death. And at that point, Hamlet's no one. I love that because for me, it's like he comes back straight into a place of death and he's no one for a second. He's not that important.
Yeah, but he doesn't recognize that.
Exactly. He cannot recognize that because he's still Hamlet. He's never not going to be Hamlet.
Well, if Hamlet has this, I would define it as a death drive, because Hamlet is obsessive with death to the point that, again, and he's so theatrical about it. He's essentially parading around the graveyard, finding out who is who, and he approaches it as this great equalizer, but as though he's almost separate from death, as though death won't even occur to him, because he's lived a million lives and died a million deaths already, because Hamlet is just this fluid. Hamlet is essentially the consciousness of the human condition.
It's interesting as well to think about the idea that death might not touch him because he's so tied to his conscious thinking self that when he dies he won't be thinking anymore, so he won't be Hamlet anymore. So it is death doesn't really touch him because his conscious thinking, philosophical self, it won't be touched by death. His body will be touched by death. After that, his mind is gone.
Or in his mind, is his mind gone?
Exactly. Yeah. I really like, is it now that he holds Yorick's skull?
Yes, he discovers the skull, and he recognizes that it was the skull of Yorick, which was a jester in the court, which is the only character that Hamlet actually has some kind of nostalgia for, that he actually has a remembrance for. He doesn't have a remembrance of his father or his mother. And there is this idea that perhaps in his childhood, Yorick was this one figure that was present with the young Hamlet. Whether this would have been a tragedy for him in the removal of the one companion that he had as formative of his demeanor towards the world, to lose this jester, which he thought of so fondly. What do you have to say about the sequence, Alas, poor Yorick?
Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest. Obviously, infinite jest after. I think I wrote down the idea of Hamlet himself being a character of infinite jest.
Okay.
Like, there's a level of kinship between his idea of Yorick, because again, we don't know Yorick, we know him through Hamlet's remembrance, right, of him. But I think the symbol of the jester is carefree, which is something that Hamlet is not.
Yeah. The archetype of a jester is the antithesis of what Hamlet is.
Yeah. Is someone carefree, someone that has a fleeting nature, right? Someone that can navigate environment with ease because he has in himself the gift of comedy, the gift of delight, which I think Hamlet lacks. And a lot of intellectuals or Luciferian complex characters in the history of literature had a kinship, either a disdain for the jester or a kinship towards the jester. And I think this is another one of those examples. But I think the jester is also the one, besides death, that shows the futility of life and social standing, of religion, of tradition. He walks around the margins of all of that. I mean, we spoke so much in Blood Meridian about the fool. I speak a lot in general in my work about the fool inverted. I think here is not the tarot fool. I think here's the jester as the court entertainer as well.
Well, here's something as well, because the jester, not even as an archetype, in terms of what that was in the court, the interesting thing about the jester is the jester, we sometimes inadvertently call the fool, but our perceptions of the fool and the jester are not one and the same.
Exactly.
Because the jester in the court was actually a relatively powerful person in that they were the only person that would be able to mock the king, which comes with a certain sense of freedom. That freedom being that they have an ability to truly say what they are thinking, unfiltered, and have it accepted within the archetype of what they are. Their archetype is complete freedom. They are what they are, which is something that Hamlet has struggled to completely fashion in and of himself.
Well, Hamlet doesn't feel like he can actually tell the king what his thoughts are.
Here's something as well. One thing about Hamlet is if you go through all of his text, you will find that perhaps more than many other Shakespearean characters, Hamlet asks many, many questions. More than most other characters. Many characters, even Claudius, everyone has moments of self-doubt, but Claudius makes declarations and whatnot. Hamlet may make declarations and then question it again a moment later. And funnily enough, with Yorick, we're looking at Hamlet stare upon the skull of this person who he says that he's rode his back many times. He says, cause it's just the skull. He says, where are your lips? Those lips I so often kissed. And then immediately after that, which is something that, again, is something that's not referenced often, he's asking a question to the skull. He's saying, where are your jibes, your gables? He's asking, where is this laughter? Where is this man that existed? Because for Hamlet, it's not about death. It's about the mind. It's about the person that you are. It's about the thoughts. It's about the dreams. That's who you are. The body is nothing. Yeah. Who I am is nothing. Who I was a moment ago is nothing. It's the totality of what I am. And I can't even grasp that because I'm so brilliant.
Yeah, I'm so ever-shifting, right?
In my knowledge of this that no one in the world seems to have, which in many ways I think is also emblematic of Shakespeare. I wonder how Shakespeare must have felt with this, to be able to capture in his art and in his writing this ability to recognize the way things are and astound people with this insight, and at the same time have no one reflect that back. There's that, that isolation that he must feel. But in relation to Hamlet, immediately after he speaks to Yorick, he then asks a question. Think about it. He's admiring the skull of a jester. And then the next thing he asks Horatio, he says, if he thinks that Alexander ever looked at things from this fashion, if he ever looked at things of this fashion in the earth. And so immediately, from this very personal moment of a truth, something that he actually feels like the to be or not to be, to sleep, something that he feels, something that he knows is true, he has to find something that is a dichotomy to it. He has to find an opposite and then put him in the shoes of Alexander the Great. And would he be looking down on this? And then he says that the skull of Yorick smells, and then he casts it back to the earth. No matter what he does, no matter what truth emerges within Hamlet, it's never sufficient enough. He will never be satisfied. He will need to find the complete opposite thing that completely destroys that version of him to create something new.
Yeah, he imagines like Julius Caesar disintegrating as well. And this idea of Alexander the Great, I think the fact that it's the great Alexander, not only any other one, is this idea that anyone, a jester, a king, a nobleman, anyone will become dust. And it goes back to that soliloquy. I mean, many of his questionings throughout the play. I think here he sees the materiality of everything that he questions. And even there, as you said, he cannot bear the reality of it. He throws the skull away. And he goes back to being the same. I mean, he could have used this moment as a moment of realization and grounding himself on the truth of the materiality of life, which we also need that, you know?
Do you want to move on to the funeral?
Yes.
Which occurs. So immediately following this, the funeral of Ophelia is occurring in front of Hamlet, and then this massive, dramatic, theatrical. It can't convince anyone. Laertes is at the funeral, and he casts himself into the ground as Ophelia is being lowered into it, out of genuine sorrow, he is overwrought with emotion. And then, I mean, it's completely ridiculous, is that as this is occurring, imagine the perspective of the people. Hamlet emerges in there, and he decries it. He said that no one could have loved her as much as he did. And he casts herself into the grave, begins fighting Laertes. Where this comes from, it seems as though that jealousy, seems as though that inability to allow other things outside of Hamlet to exist. It's as though that he has to destroy anything that isn't attached to him.
I wrote something down, which I think would be an interesting point to what you're saying, like even to tie up a little bit with the scene prior to that with Yorick's skull. Yorick's skull symbolizes Hamlet's ability to turn pain into thought, to engage with death in an abstractly and verbal way. Ophelia is denied that power. She becomes the object of death. Her suffering is swallowed by her body and her silence. The skull is something Hamlet holds and contemplates, just like her body is what others hold and bury. So she becomes a corpse. She becomes what he contemplates and he abstracts about, and he sees that. I think the reason that he throws himself and says that he loves her more than anything is that also at that point, I mentioned that before, she's perfect.
Yeah.
She has no flaw. She has nothing to talk back. She is just complete, pure, everything that he's been thinking of is death. And she is that. And I also think in a weird way, there's this inner competition between Laertes and Hamlet. I mean, it's not even a small thing. It's a big thing, right? What is the purest form of love, which is the brotherly love, or if it's Hamlet's in his own self-righteousness, because he feels himself more capable of feeling than others. That's why I think he thinks he loved her more. Because he sees himself superior as well. And the only person able to think about love so deeply, therefore he feels more. That's not necessarily true.
I think that Hamlet's melancholy comes from the inability to find structure within his own world. I think it's self-fulfilling what he does. And there is this kind of drive that he feels towards the admiration of the dead also, in that his father is what he is because it's as though he's become a total human being. It's as though he's rigid in the same way that holding the skull of Yorick, now that will never change.
Like Hamlet himself is changing.
Yeah. And that's why I'm saying that it's self-fulfilling, this melancholy that he undergoes, is because he's putting himself in that position. Why wouldn't he be saying to be or not to be? Why wouldn't he be questioning death? He's so obsessed with it because the moment that Hamlet dies, Hamlet becomes eternal. The irony being that we're going to see at the end is that he's going to be eternalized like Ophelia in a way that he's not.
Yeah. Something that I keep going back to when I think about Hamlet, and now before we continue to the thematics really quick, is this quote by Rimbaud that I wrote it down, which reminds me of him so much, and perhaps even my preoccupations about Hamlet and the tendencies of intellectual types to become Hamlet-like, or Luciferian-like, however you want to say it. And Rimbaud says, by being too sensitive, I have wasted my life. And I see that so much in Hamlet, and I don't even necessarily think he was too sensitive, perhaps, but he puts himself in those loops that it makes him unable to act, and he's unable to see anyone else but himself. He's so myopic.
I think the reason that we wouldn't use the word sensitive is because sensitive denotes that there's a sensibility, that there's some kind of empathic strain that exists within Hamlet, which we know isn't true. Although he is sensitive to things in the sense that he feels indignant of things. He feels an injustice. He feels jealous. He feels incredible negative emotions, and he feels them in a way that display his fragility as a person. But we just...
His weakness, I would say, more than fragility.
Yeah, in many ways. And I think that you can probably substitute sensitivity with weakness in that phrase, and it would describe Hamlet. And the irony being that in Himbo also mentioning that quote, he's also exacting what Hamlet is in that you have this self-awareness that you are that. And rather than engaging with action against, what is it that he says, it's the pale cast of thought, it ultimately makes you a creature of inaction, because you will continue to ruminate on it and you will continue to remain stagnant. And then ultimately what you're doing, you're inviting other people in to declare what your story is upon your death, because your death will be one of inaction. Which ultimately brings us to the final scene, which is the climax of the play, and one in which almost exclusive action takes place. The plans and double crossings of Laertes and Claudius were mentioned at the end of Act 4, in which it is their plan to dispose of Hamlet one way or the other. Claudius has taken special precaution in order to ensure that there will be no assured survivors of this plot. Laertes is the one that is going to poison his blade so that Hamlet will die no matter what. And Claudius has also poisoned the wine nearby, possibly with the assertion that Laertes as the champion may drink from it, and then he can also dispose of Laertes as well, leaving Claudius alone. What ends up happening is that a duel takes place. Horatio is present with Hamlet. Laertes arrives and they duel. Laertes strikes Hamlet once, and then there is a scuffle in which the blades are dropped, they're exchanged. Hamlet stabs Laertes also, who is hit with his poison blade. Gertrude drinks from the cup, the poison cup, and then supplies it to Hamlet also. Hamlet, upon listening to Laertes, who has espoused and told him that his blade was poisoned and that he was colluding with Claudius, then almost as an act of remembrance, because he almost forgot that he was supposed to take his vengeance on Claudius, Hamlet also then stabs Claudius. Ultimately, a quick summary before we discuss it. At this time, Fortinbras also then enters at the end, revealing that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern that were on the ship were also deceased. Horatio remains the final member that survives. In essence, the final scene is that all the major players that have been involved within this story, aside from Horatio, all pass on. But there is a lot to be said about the sequence.
Wretched Queen, adieu. I have to start with that because, I mean, this is the last thing that we hear from Hamlet. It is wild.
After all of this, after everything that we've said about the relationship with his mother, that is how he would end it. Even after all of the... ironically, she was the one person there that didn't actively betray him in that. He was betrayed by Claudius. He was betrayed by Laertes based on the rules. He wasn't anticipating that there would be a poison blade involved. And yet he calls out the queen all people.
Exactly.
Who was trying to give him the wine as an act to help him.
Yeah, as a gesture, right?
Yeah.
And it's the only soul fixation till the end. I don't know. This conversation might have put me a bit more on Freud's camp than before. Although I wasn't at all. And I'm not sure still if I am. But I think Wretched Queen, adieu is very... How do you read that line? Because I was thinking, is it dramatically, is it with anger Is it with whatever? I think it's
I
a
think
bit of all of it.
I think regardless of how you read it, I think the intent of what Hamlet is what speaks volumes of what he's trying to say.
Yeah.
I think regardless of how he says it, the fact that those are his final words.
Yeah, and then I think he says something like the rest is silence or the quiet is something like that. But that's his last words to his mother anyway.
Well, the thing is that at the end of Act 1, Hamlet writes down, in regards of getting vengeance on his uncle, he writes down in front of his father's ghost, he says, okay, the act of me taking vengeance, adieu, adieu, remember me. So who he is speaking to there implies that he perhaps is going to be speaking to his uncle because he believes his uncle to be the ultimate enactor of his father's demise. And yet he still has this preoccupied in his mind that perhaps on his dying moments, maybe it is, if anything, thinking about it now, it might actually be the most ironic thing that Shakespeare puts in the play. Because if Hamlet, at the last moment, just before he dies, has the sudden realization that he's saying adieu because he realizes the impact of his mother on this situation, that his mother is as culpable as his uncle, then it would be a delicious twist of irony that he's essentially put himself in this situation, caused his own death due to his hubris and his death drive, only to have been remembered by the incoming Fortinbras in a manner which is even more antithetical to the way that he should be remembered.
Yeah, a bit more pathetic. Those are not his last words. Those are his last words towards his mother. Yes. Just making sure that people understand where I'm coming from. And I think they are heavy and they mean a lot. But at the same time that they carry this debauchery with them.
Definitely.
I have no notes to the ending. I thought it would be good to free flow together. I actually deleted. I had notes, but I deleted my notes. And again, the triumph of will. I still think that Fortinbras is a character that represents action over inaction, the power of materiality over the abstract and verbal and the thought, even though this is coming from someone that mastered the abstract form more than anyone. But I still think that Shakespeare himself was a man of action, okay? Because you can think all of that. He's writing this. You can think all of that. But he's making those plays. He's putting those plays in the public space with people of all sorts of. I mean, it's so amazing. Think about that. People from all walks of life would just come and watch Shakespearean plays. Oh my God, that was a tongue twister. Shakespearean plays. It doesn't matter, It's action. Because he could have fought all of those beautiful, beautiful, beautiful plays and never put them to paper, but he did. And his actions, that's what makes Shakespeare. Just like Fortinbras coming to Denmark, he could have just stayed and, wallow in his own hatred and revenge. Hamlet is this is a tragedy. Those are tragic characters. But ultimately, I pity him. And I think the wretched queen, adieu, and as you said, adieu to his father as well. There's a level of it's almost childlike to say adieu. It's also very noble. It's also very of his social stature, which is something that he was so reluctant about.
I've never seen it as childish. I've seen it as a statement of his intent. I see it as the parallel between speaking to his father. I see it as a recognition of his mother's role that she played within this. Even though by the end she was actually the one comforting him, perhaps it was the maternal instinct taking part at the end when she realizes that upon the death of everyone that she may love, that ultimately her true connection would lie with Hamlet, and she realizes that too late, just as Hamlet also perhaps realized too late the role that his mother played within this. Hamlet's final lines actually are, "The rest is silence," which, again, very ironic for a man that spends his whole time verbalizing his inner world, and to finally reach death and understand perhaps it's his biggest fear, that Hamlet will speak no more.
And is almost to say that after his death, nothing matters. Like, we all continue to live. I mean, all the characters that Horatio lives, Fortinbras takes over, but the rest is silence because he's not there. And this is Hamlet. This play is about Hamlet.
Yeah.
This tragedy is about him.
He asks Horatio to essentially to explain the story of what happened here, and I love the ending of this actually because Fortinbras emerges and sees the chaos that's emerged, the carnage that's emerged. Everyone is dead, and he's asking what has happened here. Horatio is doing the best that he can to relay the information to Fortinbras, and what Fortinbras does, the way that it's described, is that he basically gives Hamlet a soldier's funeral, which is not what Hamlet is at all. And so from the remembrance of all of the people that are there, they will remember him perhaps as this great warrior. And in the world of Hamlet, that is how he would be told through the tomes of history. And it would be silent because it would be unaltering, and Hamlet would exist through history as a falsehood, the same way Ophelia would, as a falsehood.
Yeah. But I think the fact that we have a play within a play, and then in the end, even his story as being told by others doesn't matter, and everything is... I don't think this is Shakespeare saying that nothing matters at all.
No.
But there's a level of, as you said, irony to all of this.
Yeah.
And to this character that tried to be so self-contained, to explain himself, to understand himself. The rest is silence.
I think the great irony of it is that at the end of the novel, I keep calling it a novel, at the end of the play...
Well, I have to stop you there. Because we've been calling it a novel because it feels as heavy as a novel, isn't it? It doesn't really feel like as light as what you expect from a play. I mean, Shakespeare doesn't in general, but even beyond that, I think Hamlet does feel like so grandiose as well. And it justifies this, like, almost looking at it from a novel lens. The novel meaning, like, we tend to think of novels as this the great literary achievements, you know? Yeah, but anyway, go on.
Well, I think, at the end of the play, there is this very sweet irony that occurs, which is that Hamlet will be remembered through the lens of Fortinbras, which again is a man that's existed on the outskirts, that hasn't encountered any of the goings on here. He understands no context, which is ultimately how most stories are told. When we go through the literary lens, we have the benefit of hearing or being told a story from the perspective of one person, and with that you imagine that there's some deeper insight. You get to understand a deeper truism of what's going on. But the reality is that every story ultimately is also myopic. We're understanding the story of Hamlet, the story of his dead father, his incestuous mother, but only from his perspective. Again, we don't even understand. It's completely unreliable. We don't understand if it's true or not. It's just that he believes that it's true. And because Hamlet is who Hamlet is, and he personifies this absolute egoism and this absolute almost aggressive individuation, which is constantly ever changing. The borders on omniscience, although has no right to even call itself omniscience, is constant contradiction. What we end up having is a story that is just one branch of this giant tree. And the fact is that we've spent so much of our time with Hamlet, and by the end of the story, we were no closer to understanding him than we were at the beginning. And we can speak about him and use, as he would define, words. And I don't think we will ever completely understand him, because in many ways, Hamlet is all of us. Hamlet is the totality of the human condition. It's everything that is hypocritical. It's everything that is contradictory. He, and in turn Shakespeare, understood that. And to this day, I still don't think that there is a piece of literature which has overtaken it. And I don't think that there's a character that has overtaken it. Hamlet is eternal, and he always will be.